The Iron Dominion celebrated beneath rivers of golden fire, and somewhere in that blaze, a woman was being erased. Not killed, erased, stripped of her name, her rank, her future, by the one man who swore she would always have a place beside him. But here's what they never tell you about kings who choose power over people. The thing they threw away doesn't disappear. It survives. It evolves. It comes back wearing a crown they never saw coming. Stay with me until the end. This one will wreck you. If you're already here, drop a like and tell me what city you're watching from. Let's go. Tarot. The chandeliers inside the Great Hall of House Valor burned so bright that shadows had no place to hide. That was intentional. Draven Thorn had designed every corner of this palace with the understanding that shadows were where weakness lived, where hesitation curled up and festered, where men became something less than the Empire required them to be. The chandeliers burned at all hours. The torches along the corridor walls were replaced before they could gutter. Every surface that could hold a reflection did, so that any man who entered this palace would see himself small and multiplied and ultimately irrelevant against the architecture of absolute power. Draven stood at the center of the throne chamber in ceremonial black armor, and he looked exactly like what he was. A man who had never once in his adult life allowed himself to want something he could not afford to want. The Imperial Council arranged itself in a half-circle before him. 16 men, all of them old enough to remember the chaos before the Iron Dominion rose, all of them wealthy enough to have survived it by choosing correctly. They wore their finest tonight, silver chains of rank, velvet collars deep enough to drown in, rings that represented bloodlines and armies and trade agreements hammered out over decades of carefully managed bloodshed. Behind them, the assembled court waited in its full ceremonial configuration. 400 nobles, merchants of consequence, military commanders whose loyalty had been purchased and repurchased through 15 years of Draven's methodical expansion. They stood in tiered galleries that rose along both walls, faces tipped downward toward the central floor in the posture of people witnessing something they understood to be historic. At Draven's right stood Lady Seraphine Valor. She was beautiful in the architectural sense, the way a fortress is beautiful, designed to project a specific message about the cost of approach. Her gown was the deep crimson of the eastern territories she represented, cut to emphasize the height she carried like a weapon. Her dark hair was arranged with mathematical precision. She stood close enough to Draven that their arms nearly touched, and she did not look at the court below. She looked at the space above it, as though the assembled nobility were simply furniture arranged for her convenience. Draven had chosen her because she was the right choice, because the Valor bloodline controlled 7 of the eastern provinces and 3 of the most profitable sea routes in the known territories, because her family's military contracts could end the Revaran conflict within 2 years if the alliance held, because Lord General Cassian Valor had 30,000 soldiers under his personal command and had been looking for a reason to bring them fully under the Dominion's banner for years. Seraphine Valor was the correct answer to a political equation Draven had been working on since he was 17 years old. He had chosen her because choosing Nyra would have cost him everything he had already sacrificed to build. The Master of Ceremonies struck his staff against the marble floor 3 times, and the sound rang through the hall like something being sealed shut. "Lords and ladies of the Iron Dominion," the man announced, voice trained to fill spaces twice this size. "Honored commanders, allies of the throne. Alpha King Draven Thorn, first of his name, conqueror of the Northern Territories and architect of the Dominion's unification, calls this court to witness." Draven let his gaze move across the assembled faces. He did this not from habit, but from discipline. A king who did not read his court was a king who died surprised. He catalogued expressions. He noted the tension along Lord Farath's jaw that suggested the old man had heard something he was not meant to hear. He noted the way Commander Velos stood a half-step back from his usual position, signaling either fatigue or the early stages of political doubt. He noted the way certain eyes tracked not toward him, but toward a specific point near the chamber's eastern entrance. He did not let his gaze follow theirs. He had known she would come. Nyra Vale was a member of his court. She had been his sworn companion for 4 years, elevated to a rank that carried specific obligations, one of which was attendance at ceremonies of imperial significance. She had received the summons the same as everyone else. She would have understood what the ceremony was. She would have come anyway, because Naira Vale was constitutionally incapable of the kind of strategic cowardice that might have saved her from what was about to happen. Draven had loved that about her. He could not afford to love it anymore. My king. Seraphine's voice, just at the edge of his hearing, perfectly calibrated to reach only him. You're holding your breath. I'm not. Your armor shifts when you breathe normally. It hasn't shifted in 40 seconds. He exhaled. Not because she had caught him, but because she was right, and a man who allowed detectable physical tells was a man operating below his own standard. The council is watching, he said. The council is always watching. That's what councils do. She moved her hand a fraction of an inch toward his, not touching, just indicating availability. You made a decision. The decision was correct. Stand inside it. The master of ceremonies continued his formal recitation. Bloodlines, territorial agreements, the specific language of alliance that had been negotiated over 6 months of back-channel meetings and was now being presented to the court as though it had always been inevitable. Draven stood inside his decision. He did not look toward the eastern entrance. He heard her anyway. Not her footsteps. The marble was too good for that. The court too loud with its own restrained breathing. He heard her presence the way he'd always heard it, a specific quality of attention in the room that shifted when Naira Vale moved through it. People looked at her without meaning to. It was not beauty alone, though she had that. It was something harder to name, a kind of gravity, the sense that events tended to happen in whatever direction she was facing. 4 years of trusting that gravity. 4 years of councils where she sat just behind his left shoulder, and he could feel the warmth of her disagreement before she said a word. 4 years of her voice in the private hours, reading him the intelligence reports she had personally compiled because she did not trust anyone else's summaries. 4 years of her hand on his chest at 3 in the morning when the weight of empire sat on him like stone, and she said, without any attempt to make it poetic, "You're allowed to be afraid. Just don't let it make your decisions." He had made this decision. He had made it without fear. That was the part he could not reconcile. The formal recitation moved toward its conclusion. Draven heard the particular phrasing that meant the council was about to request his formal declaration, the moment at which he would speak aloud the terms of the alliance and invite Seraphine's acceptance, which had been agreed upon months ago and would be given with choreographed grace. He spoke. His voice carried without effort. He had been trained to project authority since he was old enough to understand what it meant, and his voice was one of the instruments he had perfected. Deep, unhurried, containing no question marks even when technically posing a question. He recited the terms of the alliance. He spoke Seraphine's name with the specific cadence reserved for those of paramount rank. He watched the council react with visible satisfaction, the relief of powerful men who had been waiting for this convergence for a long time. He still did not look at the eastern entrance. Seraphine accepted. Her voice did not waver. Draven registered a professional appreciation for that. Whatever she felt about this arrangement, whatever calculations ran behind those carefully neutral eyes, she had composed herself for this moment as precisely as he had. They were, in that regard, well matched. The court erupted into formal acclamation. The sound pressed against the walls and the high ceiling and came back changed, flattened, something that resembled enthusiasm, the way a drawn map resembles the actual landscape. Accurate in structure, absent in life. Draven turned. He turned because what came next required him to turn, because the protocol of rejection had a physical component, and he had written it himself 3 years ago when he was still under the impression that the Naira problem could be resolved in some cleaner fashion. He had not found a cleaner fashion. Naira Vale stood at the edge of the throne chamber floor. She had come alone. He had expected some form of composure, some surface presentation of a woman who had known this was coming and had prepared accordingly. What he had not expected was the specific quality of her stillness, not frozen, not held together by effort, but genuinely still, the way a person is still when they are completely present inside a moment they have decided to survive. She wore no ceremony tonight. Dark traveling clothes, practical, the kind that suggested she had not dressed for this occasion because she had refused to dress for this occasion. Her dark hair was unbound. She was not wearing the rank insignia he had given her. The absence was precise. It was a statement delivered without a word. Her eyes found his immediately. He had been afraid they would. They were the same color they had always been. A light, almost colorless gray, like winter sky over open water. They had always done something specific to his capacity for certainty, those eyes. They had always made certainty feel like a performance rather than a state. He held them, because he was the Alpha King, because the court was watching and would interpret every flicker, because holding her gaze while destroying her was the minimum dignity he could offer after 4 years. "Naira Vale," he said. The master of ceremonies had stepped aside. This part of the proceeding had no formal script. "Come forward." She walked across the throne chamber floor. She did not hurry. She did not perform courage, did not affect the particular straightness of spine that people wear when they want to look unafraid. She simply walked the way she always had, with that specific self-possession that he had spent 4 years trying to understand and had eventually concluded was not a strategy at all. It was just what she looked like when she was herself. The silence in the hall had gone absolute. She stopped at the appropriate distance, close enough for formal proceedings, far enough that the space between them had meaning. "My king," she said. 2 words. Perfect inflection. Nothing underneath them that could be used. Draven reached into the interior architecture he had spent 15 years building, the part of himself that processed political necessity without letting political necessity become personal. He found it. He stood in it. By the authority of the Iron Dominion, and in accordance with the laws governing sworn companionship to the throne, he said, "I hereby dissolve all oaths, obligations, and bonds between House Thorn and Naira Vale, daughter of the late Edric Vale of the Borderlands." He watched her face. There was a tremor in the muscle at the corner of her jaw. Just once. Then it was gone. "All privileges of rank are hereafter rescinded. All access to court, to council, and to Dominion territories under direct crown governance is revoked. Naira Vale, formerly of this court, is to be escorted to the northern borders by sunrise and is not to return under penalty of arrest." Silence. Then, from somewhere in the galleries, the sound of a single person shifting their weight. Naira looked at him for a long moment. Her expression did not name itself as any one thing. Not devastation, not fury, not the particular blankness that sometimes passed for dignity when people had nothing left. It was something more complicated than any of those. It was the expression of a person who had just received confirmation of something they had already known and had been hoping to be wrong about. She said, "Is there anything else, my king?" He said, "No." She turned. She walked back across the throne chamber floor, through the 400 witnesses, through the impossible silence, through the space that had held 4 years of something neither of them had ever once named outright. She reached the eastern entrance. She did not look back. The doors closed behind her without a sound. Draven faced the court. "We are adjourned," he said. He walked to the private corridor behind the throne dais, and he kept walking until he reached the tactical room 3 floors above. And then he stood in the dark for a long time before he reached for the lamp. He was aware that his hands were very steady. He was aware that his hands being very steady meant something he did not have time to look at directly. He lit the lamp and pulled the first map toward him and began planning the Ravarin campaign. She did not cry until she cleared the outer wall. Not the palace wall. The outer city wall. 2 miles of organized stone that separated the imperial capital from the northern road that began climbing immediately into the cold once you crossed the gate. She crossed it on horseback with 2 of Draven's guards flanking her at a distance that communicated supervision without interaction. And when the city vanished behind the first ridge, she stopped the horse, and she sat there in the early dark with the wind coming off the highland, and she let herself cry for exactly as long as she needed to. She had known. She had known for 3 months since the first Valor delegation arrived, with its carefully itemized ledger of what that alliance would purchase. Since she read the preliminary council notes and understood what the numbers meant, and sat in the small study off the king's private quarters, and looked at the map of the eastern territories and traced the Valor trade routes with her finger and said to herself, "He's going to do it." Knowing had not made it smaller. She wiped her face on her sleeve and looked at the road ahead. The guards behind her were keeping their distance because they were not entirely comfortable with what they had been asked to do tonight. and they were expressing their discomfort through the specific avoidance behavior of men who considered themselves honorable and had been given orders that strained that self-image. She had worked alongside these men for years. Sergeant Torvin, who was 42 and had a daughter with her mother's laugh. Private Cass, who brought his own tea from home because he did not trust garrison supplies and drank it with the focused reverence of a man communing with something sacred. "Torvin," she called. The sergeant brought his horse forward. "Commander?" He caught himself. "Naira. You're going to ride me to the border checkpoint at Kelhar's Pass, and then you're going to give me what's in your left saddlebag." Torvin's jaw moved. "Don't," she said. "I know it's there because you're too good at your job to let me ride into the northern wilderness without supplies, and the king's order didn't specify that I had to survive the wilderness, just that I had to cross the border. So whatever you've packed, I'm grateful." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "There's a physician's kit, dried meat and hardtack for 2 weeks, a sleeping roll, and my wife's contact name in the Kelhar settlement. She knows people who winter north of the pass." "Does she know why?" "She knows that someone I trust needs a bed and a direction." Nira nodded. She turned back to the road. They rode north. The cold came on faster than she remembered it could. She had spent most of the last 4 years in the warmth of the imperial capital, in the heated corridors of a palace designed to eliminate the memory of discomfort. The northern road had no interest in eliminating discomfort. It was built for movement, not comfort. Hard-packed earth that remembered every wheel that had crossed it, banked on both sides by terrain that grew less managed with every mile. She let herself think about the body problem because the body problem was immediate and the other problems were catastrophic, and catastrophic problems required, in her experience, a baseline of survival to address. She was 4 months along. She had known for 6 weeks. Had not told him. Had spent those 6 weeks watching the Valor negotiation build toward inevitability and making a specific calculation about what it would mean to add one more variable to a situation that was already beyond her capacity to alter. She had not told him because telling him would have made her a political liability instead of just a personal one, because the information would have been weaponized in ways she could not control. Because Seraphine Valor's family had demonstrated, over a career spanning decades, that they handled complications efficiently, and a complication carrying the king's bloodline was the kind of complication they would handle permanently. She had not told him because she had looked at his face in the 3 weeks before the announcement, and she had seen the decision already made, already sealed, and she had understood that this man, this specific man, who she had known better than anyone else alive, had crossed a threshold past which personal information did not function the way it was supposed to function, past which love, even real love, was simply insufficient data. He had chosen. She was the thing he had chosen to lose. She could not afford to let her survival depend on him reversing that. Torvin's wife's contact in the Kelhar settlement was a broad woman named Hista, with weather in her face and eyes that conducted a very efficient assessment in the first 30 seconds. She looked at Naira's gear, her posture, the specific way she dismounted and stood with her weight slightly shifted to distribute discomfort, and she said, "How far along?" Nira told her. Hesta said, "Come inside." That was the whole of the welcome. It was enough. The settlement sat on the windward side of the pass, which was objectively the wrong side architecturally, but had the advantage of being the side the Imperial patrols checked least frequently. Naira spent her first 2 weeks there learning the rhythms of a place that survived by remaining beneath the notice of the empire she had spent 4 years helping to build. The irony was not lost on her. She did not spend much time with irony. Survival was a practice that required constant attendance and resented distractions. She helped with the winter butchering, which she was bad at for the first 3 days and merely adequate at by the end of the week. She learned which of the settlement's supply lines were reliable and which were subject to the kind of creative bookkeeping that indicated the supplier was also dealing with factions she needed to know about. She learned who in the settlement had Dominion informants and kept a specific distance from those individuals without signaling that she knew. At night, she lay in the narrow bed Hesta had cleared for her, and she put her hand on her stomach, and she talked to the person inside her in a low voice that no one else could hear. She said, "I don't know where we're going yet. I know you're too small to care, but I want you to know I'm working on it." She said, "Your father is not a bad man. He is a man who made a choice, Those are different things, and the difference matters. She said, "You're going to be extraordinary. That's not wishful thinking. I have evidence." On the 14th night in the settlement, 3 men arrived from the south. They wore civilian clothes but carried themselves with the specific efficiency of professional soldiers, and they were asking about a woman traveling alone who had recently crossed the northern border. Nira heard about it from the settlement's youngest resident, a girl of about 12, who had adopted her as an object of practical study and had developed the useful habit of reporting everything she observed in exchange for lessons in map reading. 3 of them, the girl said. Marin's husband let them use the common room. They've got velour silver. She demonstrated by holding her fingers at a specific width, indicating the coins. Velour silver was minted with an Eastern cross on the back that distinguished it from Dominion Standard issue. Nira looked at the maps spread across her borrowed table. She had been afraid of exactly this. Seraphine's people were thorough, and a woman carrying a potential heir was the kind of loose end that thorough people closed quickly. How long since they arrived? Maybe an hour? She folded the most important maps, the ones showing the northern trade routes and the Ravaran border crossings she had memorized from Draven's intelligence reports, and replicated from memory, into the lining of her coat. She put everything else she owned into the pack in under 4 minutes. She found Hesta in the back kitchen. "There's a route," she said, not phrasing it as a question. Hesta wiped her hands on her apron. "East Ridge. Gets rough past the second marker, but stays rough all the way to the Ravaran lowlands without touching the road." "How rough?" "Rough enough that they'll think twice." She looked at Nira's midsection. "And you should think twice." "I've already thought twice. I need the route," Hesta told her. Nira left through the back of the settlement with the cold hitting her immediately and the stars overhead doing their indifferent ancient work. She moved east along the ridge with the settlement's lights fading behind her and the darkness ahead full of things she could not yet name. She was not afraid in the disabling sense. She had learned in 4 years at the center of an imperial court that fear was information. It told you what needed attention, and once you had given it attention, it had done its job and you could move. She was afraid of the cold. She attended to it by moving fast and timing her rest periods to stay ahead of heat loss. She was afraid of what came next. She attended to it by putting 1 foot in front of the other on a ridge that required the full budget of her concentration to navigate in the dark. She was afraid, in a specific and piercing way, for the person she was carrying, for the fundamental unfairness of bringing someone into a set of circumstances she had not chosen and could not fully control. She attended to this by making, in the silence and the cold and the dark, a specific promise. She was not going to disappear. She was going to get somewhere. She was going to find whatever came next and build it with her own hands, and it was going to be enough. Not because she was certain she could do it, because there was no acceptable alternative to doing it. She crested the second ridge marker in the dark and felt the terrain change beneath her feet. Looser, colder, more exposed. The settlement's voice had said rough. It was rough. She went anyway. The Ravaran lowlands announced themselves through smell before sight, a particular quality of cold air that carried wood smoke and pine resin and something mineral from the river systems that cut through the territory's interior. Different from the north, different from the iron and stone scent of the Dominion capital. Nira crossed the unmarked border in early morning and kept moving south until she hit a road. She sat on a stone at the road's edge and ate the last of the dried meat Torvin had packed and considered her situation with the deliberate clarity that exhaustion sometimes produced, a stripping away of the unnecessary that left the essential things visible. She was in enemy territory. She was visibly foreign, visibly exhausted, and visibly in a physical state that would attract attention from anyone with basic observational skills. She had resources that amounted to the maps in her coat lining, specific knowledge of Dominion military strategy from years of close involvement with the King's tactical planning, and a professional ability to assess situations quickly. That last one was the only thing that was going to matter. She heard the horses before she saw them. 3 riders, Ravaran military by the cut of their armor, darker colors than Dominion standard, no ceremonial elements, built entirely for function. They spotted her at roughly the same moment she spotted them, and they came to a stop at a distance that was deliberate. The lead writer had the bone structure and the specific quality of attention that suggested he was the most important person in this group, regardless of what the rank marking said. Northern border crossing, he said. Not a question. His accent was Eastern Ravaran, more clipped than the Western variety. Alone. As you can see, she said. He studied her for a moment. She could see the calculation happening. You came across the East Ridge last night. I did. In the dark, through rough terrain. He shifted his weight slightly. Running from something or toward something. She had spent 4 years in the company of a man who valued the direct answer because it demonstrated you weren't afraid to give it. She had internalized that lesson in ways she hadn't fully cataloged until this moment. Both, she said. He dismounted. She watched this without moving because how a person dismounted told you something about them. And this man dismounted with the efficiency of someone who had made the horse-to-ground transition thousands of times and had never once performed it for an audience. He walked toward her without rushing and stopped at a conversational distance. You're pregnant, he said. Not cruel, just observational, with the accuracy of someone who paid attention to information as a professional habit. Also, as you can see, and you crossed that ridge last night. I'm aware of my own timeline. Something shifted in his expression, not quite amusement, the recognition of an edge, perhaps. What's your name? She thought about this for 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, she mapped the decision tree with the speed that 4 years of intelligence work had trained into her. She was in Ravaran. She was going to need help. The kind of help available in Ravaran was calibrated by who was offering it and what they wanted in return. This man was clearly military, clearly above field rank, and had not moved aggressively despite having every contextual reason to detain a foreign national crossing his border illegally. He was waiting. That meant he was already interested in what she represented. What she represented, if she was honest, was a Dominion court insider who had very recently lost her reason to protect Dominion interests. She gave him the piece of her truth that was most likely to be useful. Naira Vale, formerly of the Iron Dominion, specifically, formerly of King Draven Thorn's inner court. The reaction was subtle but complete, a brief realignment in the way he was holding himself, a recalculation visible only to someone watching for it. Formerly, he said, as of 3 days ago. He looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze because she had learned to hold gaze with men of authority and because she had nothing to hide that he could find without her permission. I'm Kael, he said finally, commander of the 2nd Territorial Division, Lord Malric's man. A brief pause. You should come with me. To what end? Warmth, food, medical access. His gaze moved briefly to her midsection, and a conversation with a man who has spent 5 years looking for any material edge over Draven Thorn. She stood. The standing cost her more than she let show. The ridge crossing had extracted its payment in the form of her right ankle, which had turned on loose stone in the dark and had been managing on functional stubbornness since. She compensated well. Not perfectly. Kael saw it. He didn't comment. He signaled his riders to bring a second horse. She mounted without assistance. They rode south into the Ravaran lowlands with the morning light beginning to build in the eastern sky, and Naira let herself feel, for the first time since the throne chamber, something that had a shape she could work with. Not hope. Hope was too soft a word for what survival required. Something harder. Something that did not require good outcomes, only the willingness to continue building in their direction. She kept her hand on her stomach for the first mile, and then she took it away and held the reins. Malric Duskbane's Forward Territory Command occupied a converted hunting estate 3 miles from the lowland road. Chosen, she would later understand, because its footprint from the air looked residential rather than military, and because its interior had been rebuilt from the foundation up to serve purposes its original architects had never imagined. Kael brought her through the main entrance and handed her to a physician without ceremony, which was the right call, and which told her something about Kael that she filed. A man who prioritized function over theater in small moments usually did the same in large ones. The physician was a woman in her 50s named Sefra, who had the hands of someone who had spent 3 decades making consequential decisions under pressure and had developed the particular efficiency of someone who did not have time for performance. Sephra examined her without asking permission, which was also right. Ankle's sprained, not broken. You'll ice it and stay off it for 2 days. She made it sound like a military order. The baby is fine. Your blood pressure is elevated, which is expected, and your nutrition is inadequate, which we're going to address immediately. She stood. You pushed hard to get here. I had to. You had to get here, specifically. It wasn't quite a question. Neera looked at her. I had to get somewhere that was not behind me, she said. This is what was ahead. Sephra left without elaborating. Neera ate the food that arrived, which was simple and hot, and tasted like the most honest thing she had consumed in months. She sat in the chair by the window and watched the estate's interior motion, the organized activity of a military installation that had learned to look like something else, and she composed herself with the specific method she had developed for situations where composing herself was necessary and there was no time to be any other way. She was doing this because she had made a promise to someone who could not hear it yet. Malric Dustbane came to her at midday. He was taller than his intelligence profile had suggested. The profiles she had helped compile were based on intercepted communications, border agent reports, and the accounts of 3 Dominion assets who had been in his presence over the previous 2 years, and they had collectively captured something of his strategic capability and almost nothing of how he occupied physical space. He occupied it with the particular density of someone who had spent decades proving that his presence meant something and had arrived at a point where he no longer needed to prove it. He sat across from her without preamble. He looked at her face for a moment, then at her midsection, then back at her face. You compiled the Rivaran sector analysis, he said, last year, the one that recommended the western flank approach. She had. The analysis had been one of her most precise pieces of work. 3 months of data synthesis, personally delivered to Draven in a format she had designed specifically for his reading pattern. Yes, she said, that analysis cost me 400 soldiers and my most defensible river position. His voice was even. It was very good work. I know. He looked at her for a moment. You're pregnant with Draventhorn's heir, he said. I am. And he exiled you. He did. And now you're in my territory, in my command, asking for... He paused. What are you asking for? She had been composing the answer to this question since the Ridge. Not because she needed the words, she knew the words. Because she needed to be certain she was giving him the true version and not the version that was easiest to give. Protection, she said, for me and for my child. Honestly provided, not contingently provided. Not offered as leverage and withdrawn when the leverage situation changes. And in exchange, 5 years of Dominion intelligence, everything I have access to from the inside of that court, military strategy, council dynamics, Seraphine Vaylor's actual power structure, and its vulnerabilities, which are significant and have been deliberately obscured from Draven himself. She held his gaze. And I will help you read Draventhorn, because I am the only person alive who knows how he thinks when he is losing and what he does when he is afraid, and those 2 conditions are going to become relevant in the next 18 months. Silence. Malric looked at her with the expression of a man performing a calculation he was very confident about, but was checking twice anyway. You loved him, he said. That's not relevant to the proposal. It's relevant to how reliable you are. She looked back at him with the steadiness that was not the absence of feeling, but the management of it. I loved him, she said. He rejected me, dissolved our bond, and ordered me into exile. His betrothed sent professional killers to close the loose end I represented. I crossed the eastern ridge in the dark with a sprained ankle and 4 months of pregnancy and no guarantee of anything on the other side. She paused. How reliable do I need to be? Malric was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, My physician says you need 2 days off that ankle. I know. There's a room on the east side of the compound, private entrance. My staff will leave you alone unless you want them. She held herself very still. I want to be clear about what I'm offering, he said, and his voice shifted slightly. Not softer, but more direct, less diplomatic. This is not charity, and it's not leverage. I have a use for what you know. You have a need for what I can provide. Those 2 things can coexist without either of us being diminished by the arrangement. He stood. Ravarin doesn't treat its people as expendable. You'll find that different from what you're used to. He left. Nira sat in the chair by the window and watched the afternoon light change over the Ravarin lowlands and let herself understand for the first time that she might actually survive this, not escape it, not reverse it, not fix the thing that had broken. Survive it, build something, become something that the empire she had served and the man who had discarded her would eventually have to reckon with. Outside, across the thousands of miles of territory and politics and consequence that now separated them, Draven Thorn was planning the Ravarin campaign. He did not know yet what he had sent north to be shaped by the cold. He did not know about Lucien. He would not know for 5 years. And when he finally came for Ravarin, riding at the head of his armies with the absolute certainty of a man who had never once lost, he would ride down from the hills and see his greatest enemy descending the palace steps with a small boy beside him, the boy with his eyes. And the world Draven Thorn had built on the grave of everything he sacrificed would crack at the foundation and keep cracking, and he would finally understand too late what he had thrown away in that throne chamber. Not a woman, a kingdom. 5 years moved the way wars move, not in a straight line, but in the shape of what survival required. Nyra Vale learned Ravarin the way she learned everything, by going directly at the parts that resisted her. The language first, because language was the difference between being understood and being managed, and she had no interest in being managed. Within 4 months, she could conduct a full intelligence briefing in Eastern Ravarin dialect without pausing for words. Within 8 months, she was dreaming in it. Within a year, Malric's senior commanders had stopped making the small, unconscious adjustments people make when speaking to a foreigner, and had begun treating her the way they treated each other, with the particular shorthand of people who have stopped performing professionalism and started doing the actual work. Lucien arrived in late winter, 3 weeks ahead of the physician's estimate, in the middle of a snowstorm that knocked out the estate's eastern heating systems and required everyone in the compound to consolidate into the central hall. He came into the world in a room full of people who had absolutely no investment in his bloodline and every practical reason to view him as a complication, and he announced himself with a cry that Sephra later described as operationally excessive. Nyra held him and looked at his face and felt the specific terror of a person who has just understood that their definition of survival has permanently expanded. He had Draven's eyes. She had known this was possible, had prepared for it, and was still not prepared for it. The same light gray, almost colorless, that looked like winter sky over open water and did something specific to her capacity for certainty. She held him anyway. She held him for a long time. Malric came to the doorway of the room and looked at the child with the expression of a man conducting an assessment and arriving at a conclusion that surprised him. "He's healthy?" he said. Sephra says yes. He was quiet for a moment. "What's his name?" She had been working on this. She had a list. She had discarded most of it for being either too obviously Dominion or too pointedly Ravarin, both of which carried political weight she did not want attached to someone who hadn't yet developed the muscle to carry it. "Lucien," she said. Malric nodded once. "Good name." He turned to leave. "Malric." He stopped. She looked at him from across the room with her son in her arms, and the storm working against the walls outside, and the compound's consolidated heat making the air close and warm. "Thank you, for the room, for Sephra, for all of it." He turned back just enough to make eye contact. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "He's going to need a great deal more than a room." Then he left, which was its own answer. The 5 years built themselves the way foundations build, not quickly, not in ways that were always visible, but in the kind of incremental accumulation that becomes, without anyone fully registering the transition, something that bears weight. Nyra rebuilt her intelligence methodology inside Ravarin's military structure. She was careful about this initially, deliberate about the pace at which she moved from guest to contributor to essential. She had watched enough courts to know that people who moved too fast looked dangerous, and people who looked dangerous in borrowed territory got managed. She moved at the pace of demonstrated competence, which was its own most effective argument. By Lucien's first year, she was formally attached to Malric's Strategic Advisory Council. not as a defector, not as a foreign asset, but as someone with a specific expertise that Rivarin needed and that the existing structure did not contain. Draven's campaign patterns, his decision-making architecture under pressure, the specific ways that the Dominion's strength was also, in particular circumstances, the shape of its vulnerability. She gave them what she had, and she was honest about what she didn't know, which built trust faster than any intelligence she could have provided. Because the people she was working with were professionals who understood the difference between someone sharing knowledge and someone managing their image. Malric himself was the part she had not fully anticipated. She had expected, going in, a transactional relationship, clear terms, mutual utility, the kind of professional arrangement that sustained itself through function and required no particular warmth to operate. What she had not expected was that he would be interested in her in the way that serious people are interested in other serious people. Not romantically, not as a function of what she could provide, but with the specific quality of attention that comes from recognizing someone who operates at a level you take seriously. He asked her questions, real ones, not the performance of curiosity, but the actual thing. He wanted to understand how she had compiled the Western flank analysis, what methodology she had used, where she thought her own conclusions were strongest and where she suspected weakness. He wanted to know how Draven ran his council and what the internal politics looked like from inside the room. He wanted to know what she thought would break the Dominion's Eastern alliances fastest if pressure were applied correctly. She answered. She pushed back when she disagreed. He pushed back in return, and there was a quality to the exchange, a friction that generated something useful rather than heat for its own sake, that she had not had with anyone since before the throne chamber. It made her careful. Not suspicious, but careful. She had learned, at significant personal cost, that she was capable of confusing the experience of being understood with safety, and that those two things were not the same. Lucien grew. He grew the way children grow when they are genuinely cared for by an ecosystem rather than maintained by obligation, with a fundamental expectation that the world was mostly well-intentioned toward him, which produced in him a specific ease she recognized as the thing she had been working to give him, and that still caught her off guard each time she saw it in his face. He was curious, intensely, operationally curious, the kind that drove adults to distraction because it did not respond well to the answer, because that is how it is. He wanted to understand mechanisms. He wanted to know why things worked the way they worked, and what would happen if they worked differently. He took things apart, including things that were not meant to be taken apart, and occasionally put them back together in configurations that were technically functional and aesthetically incorrect. At 3, he followed Malric's senior commander Kael around the compound for an entire day, asking questions about the horses. At 4, he spent a week attempting to teach himself to read using a military dispatch he had stolen from a desk and could not actually decipher but was convinced he was making progress on. At 5, he walked into the middle of one of Niera's briefings with his wooden training sword and asked, with the absolute sincerity of someone who could not imagine the answer being no, whether he could watch. Malric said yes before Niera could respond. She looked at him across the briefing table. He looked back with an expression that was not quite a challenge and not quite an apology. She let it go, partly because Lucien had already settled himself in the corner with the focused attention of someone taking notes in their head, and removing him now would cost more in disruption than his presence. Partly because she understood, watching Malric watch her son, that something was already happening that she hadn't fully tracked. It happened incrementally, the way the most significant things happened. Malric was not demonstrative. He was not the kind of man who made gestures or announced intentions. He showed up. He was consistent. He came to the briefings where Lucien was present without making it remarkable. He answered the child's questions about swords and horses and the mechanics of territorial defense with the same directness he brought to everything else, not condescending, not performing warmth, just speaking to him as though he were a person whose curiosity was reasonable. Lucien responded to this the way plants respond to light, not dramatically, but inexorably, orienting toward it and staying there. Niera watched all of this and kept her hands steady on her work and made herself be honest about what she was observing. There was a man and her son, and a bond forming between them that she had not engineered and could not fully control, and her job was to determine whether it was safe. She determined it was safe. She determined it was more than safe. She determined it was exactly what Lucien needed, and that her fear of it was her own, related to a lesson she had learned at significant cost about what happens when you trust someone's commitment without examining the architecture beneath it. Malric's architecture held. Auschwitz. In the 5th year, Draventhorn came to Ravarin with an army. They knew it was coming. The intelligence picture had been building for 18 months by border incidents, supply route pressure, the systematic diplomatic isolation of Ravarin's southern allies that Nira had identified as the precursor move in every major Dominion campaign she had analyzed. She had written the strategic assessment herself. She had put it in Malric's hands 8 months before the 1st Dominion Regiment crossed the border. The assessment said, "He will not negotiate until he believes negotiation costs less than war." The assessment said, "He will push until he hits something that does not move." The assessment said, "The goal is not to win this war conventionally. The goal is to make this war expensive enough that he calculates differently." It was the same methodology she had used to analyze Ravarin for the Dominion, turned in the other direction. The irony was one she had made her peace with. The news arrived at the forward command in the form of a rider who had covered 60 miles in under 10 hours, which meant the rider had destroyed 2 horses to get there, and the situation was serious enough to justify it. Malric read the dispatch standing. He handed it to Nira without comment. She read it. The words settled in her chest with the specific weight of things that have been expected and are still heavy when they arrive. "Timeline," she said. 3 days to the outer valley. Less if they push the cavalry ahead of the infantry. He'll push the cavalry. He always does. He wants the psychological effect of the forward force before the main body arrives. Malric looked at her. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." She folded the dispatch and set it on the table. He used the same approach at Kelrath, at the Vessen crossing, at the Northern Consolidation 3 years ago. Fast cavalry first to destabilize the defensive positioning, create a sense of envelopment before the actual envelopment is possible. It buys him 48 hours of strategic advantage just from the fear effect. So we don't give him the fear effect. We don't show him anything that confirms the cavalry is working. Hold the outer positions. Don't retreat. Let him ride into the valley and find that it hasn't moved. Kael, at the far end of the table, said, "That's easy to say from here." "I know," she said. "I also know that if the outer valley folds on contact, he'll have his read on our psychology within 6 hours, and he'll design everything that comes after around it." She looked at him directly. "I've watched him do it. I know what comes after." The room was quiet. Malric said, "What comes after?" She said, "He gets inside your decision cycle. He starts moving faster than you can respond to. The campaign stops being about territory and starts being about tempo, and he controls the tempo, and everything after that is fighting upstream." She paused. "The outer valley has to hold." Malric looked at the map on the table. He looked at it for a long time with the expression of a man who was calculating not just the military position, but the total cost in the specific currency that couldn't be put on maps. The people, the permanence, the things that didn't come back. "I'll take the outer valley command," he said. "That's not my decision." He said it without heat, just the flat certainty of a man who had made the call and was not revisiting it. She held his gaze. "You don't need to be at the outer valley. My commanders hold better when I'm present. You know this." She did know this. She resented knowing this because it made the argument she was building collapse under its own weight. "Lucien," she said, "is here with you." He held her eyes. "You're not going anywhere that requires him to be unprotected." It was not a question. "I'm going to the capital," she said. "We've had this conversation. You agreed." "I agreed you would be at the War Palace for the strategic coordination, not at the valley." "I know where I'm supposed to be." "Then we both know where we're supposed to be." He picked up his field jacket from the chair. "Kael's division rides in 2 hours. I'll take the 3rd. He moved toward the door, then stopped. "He's going to see something he doesn't expect when he gets here." She said, "He's going to see that this place didn't fold." Malric said, "He's going to see that what he threw away didn't disappear." He left without elaborating. She stood in the briefing room with the map and the folded dispatch and the specific quality of silence that follows a decision that has already started happening. Then she went to find Lucien. Bisca. He was in the training yard with one of Kael's younger soldiers, working on a sequence he had been practicing for 3 weeks, with the focused repetition of someone who understood that mastery was a product of accumulation. He was 5 years old and already had the footwork of someone twice his age, which Naira attributed partly to genetics and partly to the compound's culture of taking him seriously when he asked to learn things. He saw her coming and stopped the sequence. He had Draven's eyes and her face, and the combination produced something that was entirely its own, a quality of attention, a particular stillness when he was reading a situation that she had seen in neither of them individually, and that she suspected was the specific product of whatever alchemy happened when two very different kinds of intelligence combined in one person. "Something happened," he said. "Yes." "The writer this morning?" "Yes." He waited. This was also something she had given him. The understanding that information given when you were ready for it was more useful than information given to fill silence. "We have company coming," she said, "from the south." "The Dominion." She looked at him carefully. They had been honest with him, both she and Malric, about the general shape of the world he had been born into. Not the specifics, not yet, not at 5, but the shape. That there was an empire to the south, that Raverin existed in tension with it, that some of the work the adults around him did was about managing that tension before it became something worse. "The Dominion," she confirmed. "Malric is handling it. You and I are going to the War Palace." "To work." "To work." He nodded once. Then he turned back to his training partner and said, "I need to finish this sequence. 10 more minutes." The soldier looked at Naira. She nodded. She stood at the yard's edge and watched her son practice his footwork in the morning cold, and felt the full weight of everything that was moving toward them. The army, the man at its head, the 5 years of distance and consequence that separated the throne chamber from this training yard. And she breathed through it the way she had learned to breathe through the things she could not stop. Not denial, not dissociation, just the deliberate act of staying present inside something difficult, because that was the only way through it. The War Palace at Ravarin's capital, Duskavar, was nothing like the Iron Dominion's gleaming brutalism. Where Draven built to intimidate, Malric had built to function. The palace was layered, fortified, designed for actual siege situations, rather than the aesthetic impression of impregnability. It had 7 distinct internal defensible positions, 3 separate command centers that could operate independently, and a network of passage corridors that allowed communication between sections without exposure to the central halls. Nira moved through it with Lucien at her side, and the War Palace's senior staff adjusting around her with the practiced ease of people who had long since resolved the question of her authority and no longer needed to perform the resolution. She set up the Strategic Coordination Center in the secondary command room. Her preference, because the primary room was designed for meetings and the secondary was designed for work, which meant the table was the right height and the lighting was functional rather than ceremonial. She deployed the intelligence picture across the table's surface. Every piece of information they had on Draven's current campaign deployment, his supply line positions, his cavalry formations, and their commanders. She had been building this picture for 5 years. She knew it the way she knew the maps she had memorized from his private tactical rooms. Not as data, but as a system, something with its own internal logic that told you not just where the pieces were, but where they were going. Lucien sat at the end of the table with a smaller map she had designated as his and a task she had given him, tracking the position markers as updates came in from the field runners. He did this with absolute concentration, moving the markers with the precision of someone who understood that the markers were not symbols. They were people. She had told him that, early. When he first started sitting in on strategic sessions and treating the colored markers as pieces in a game, she had sat with him afterward and explained what each marker meant. Whose division? How many people? What they had left behind to be here. He had not treated the markers the same way after that. The first field update arrived 3 hours after they reached the palace. Dominion cavalry had made contact with the Outer Valley positions. Kael's leading units had held. No retreat. Second update, 2 hours later. Main cavalry force pressing. Malric's position holding. Outer defensive line intact. Third update, an hour after that. Draven's advance riders were at the valley entrance. She read this one twice. He was here. She had known this intellectually. She had been planning for it for 8 months. And still the specific information that the man who had destroyed her was now within the same geographic boundary as her child produced a reaction in her body that bypassed her capacity for strategic processing. A cold, specific animal response that she felt in her spine, in her hands, and in the specific tightening of her throat. She breathed through it. She kept her hands on the table and she breathed through it and she kept working. Lucian looked up from his map. He looked at her face with those winter gray eyes. Mom, I'm fine. You're not fine. You got that face. I have a face. The one where you look like you're doing math that hurts. He held her gaze. Who's out there? She had not planned this conversation. She had planned a version of it for when he was older, 7, 8, old enough to hold the complexity without the information becoming simply a wound. She had not planned it for now, for this room, with the field updates arriving and the army at the valley entrance. She looked at her son. She said, "The man who leads the Dominion army is someone I used to know. Before you were born." His expression did not flinch. He was 5 and he had grown up in a military compound with adults who did not condescend to him, and he was already better at staying present inside information than most people twice his age. "Used to know," he said, in the tone of someone identifying a gap. "It's complicated," she said. "Most important things are." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "We'll talk about it properly when this is done." He held her eyes for another second, checking whether this was the real answer or the deferred one. He determined, correctly, that it was both. "Okay," he said. He turned back to his map. The third marker moved. "Do I update that?" "Update it," she said. She turned back to the intelligence picture and did what she had taught herself to do with things that were too large for the current moment. She put them in the specific pocket she maintained for exactly this purpose, closed it firmly, and returned to the work. Draven rode into the Ravaran Valley in the early afternoon and found it exactly as the intelligence reports had described and completely unlike what he had expected. The reports had said the outer positions were defended. They had said Malric held the ridge lines and the valley approach with a force considerably smaller than what Draven was bringing. They had said the defensive posture was disciplined, organized, and showed no signs of the fracture that typically appeared in forces facing overwhelming numbers. The reports had been accurate. What they had failed to communicate was the quality of the stillness. He had ridden into defensive positions across 15 years of campaigning, and he had learned to read the texture of what resistance looked like from the other side. There was the resistance of desperation, which produced a specific kind of visible tension in how soldiers held their positions. Too tight, too still. The stillness of people trying not to let fear make them move. There was the resistance of professional pride, which was more controlled but always had a quality of watching, of tracking the opponent rather than simply occupying the ground. What he found in the Ravaran Valley was something else. These soldiers were occupying the ground the way people occupy territory they consider home, not defiant, not desperate, just present, in the specific way of people who have decided that this is where they are and have no particular anxiety about what that means. It was unsettling. He did not let it show. He pulled his horse up at the valley entrance with his advance guard, and he looked at the ridgeline where Malric's position held, and he felt the familiar landscape of campaign intelligence reorganizing itself around a piece of information it had not previously contained. "Commander Velos," he said. The senior commander brought his horse alongside. "My king." "What's the defensive anchor on the eastern ridge?" Velos studied the position. "Third unit. Kael's division, based on the insignia. Well positioned. They've got the high ground on both flanks and the approach is exposed for 200 yards before you reach the base of the ridge. Supply lines. Coming from the north, but there's a secondary route through the eastern pass that we can't see from here." Draven looked at the ridge for a long time, a secondary route through the eastern pass. He had not seen that in the intelligence picture. He should have seen it. His intelligence apparatus was one of the best resourced in the known territories, and they had failed to identify a secondary supply line, which meant either his people had missed it or someone had made sure it was not in his picture. "Who compiled our Ravaran intelligence package?" he said. Velos had the look of a man who had just understood something unpleasant. "Lord General Cassian Valor's people. Seraphine's family manages the Eastern Network. The thing that moved through Draven's chest in that moment was not quite anger. It was the specific, cold recognition of a man who has just seen the shape of how he has been managed. He kept it from his face. He kept it in the controlled interior where he kept all the things he was not yet ready to act on and let himself understand it fully before it became anything visible. "We established the siege line at the valley mouth," he said. "Standard formation. Don't advance up the ridge." Velus blinked. "My king, with our numbers, the ridge would fall in. We established the siege line at the valley mouth." He said it the same way he had said it the first time. Not louder, not harder. Just exactly the same, which was the specific register that communicated that the conversation was done. Velus fell back. Draven looked at the ridge. Something in this tactical picture was wrong. The Valor intelligence had steered him toward the valley approach specifically, had made it seem like the obvious route, the one with the clearest path to a conventional military outcome. And now he was standing in the valley approach looking at a defensive position that was better than it should have been, and a supply network that was more sophisticated than the reports had suggested. He needed time. He needed to think. He also needed to understand why the command position on the Ravaran Ridge had a banner configuration he didn't recognize, not standard Ravaran military. Something else. Something that used the Northern Wolf insignia in combination with Ravaran standard colors in a way that was either a new development or a recent alliance he had not been briefed on. He looked at it for a long time. Something stirred in his chest, something old and without a clean name that he had buried under 15 years of empire and was choosing, in this moment, not to examine. He rode back to the command position. He sent for his intelligence lead. He started asking the questions that the Valor briefings had not asked, which meant he was beginning to understand, slowly and with the particular resistance of a man who does not want to arrive at a specific conclusion, that the picture of this campaign had been shaped for him before he ever marched. The message arrived at the War Palace from Malric's personal runner the following morning. Nyra read it at the coordination table with Lucian still asleep in the next room and the city of Duskavar beginning its daily noise outside the walls. Draven had not advanced. He had established a siege line at the valley mouth and held it there through the night. No cavalry push. No probing attacks on the ridge, just the siege line, which was either a conventional patience play or something else entirely. She read the message twice. Then she read it a third time, this time looking at the specific language Malric had used. He had noted that Draven's cavalry commanders had sent out a second reconnaissance sweep of the eastern pass at dawn. Not standard siege protocol. Standard siege protocol didn't care about the eastern pass until you needed the supply line. This was someone specifically looking for something they had not been told about. He knows his intelligence picture is wrong, she thought. Not everything, but something. The specific cold moved through her again, and she attended to it and set it aside. She was writing the response brief when Lucian appeared in the doorway in a state of partial breakfast, holding a piece of hardtack and the smaller map she had given him. "The cavalry didn't move," he said. She looked at him. "How do you know that?" "I heard the runner. And the siege line position hasn't changed on my map." He held up the map, which had his own marker notation in the corner, smaller versions of the symbols she used, replicated with the accuracy of someone who had been watching her methodology long enough to absorb it. She looked at the map, at the markers, at the notation. She felt something she was not prepared to feel and had no time to feel. "That's good work," she said. He shrugged. "Malric told me that if the enemy stops moving, it usually means they stop to think. And people who stop to think are harder to beat than people who keep moving." Nira looked at her son. She said, "When did he tell you that?" "Last month, when we were going over the Kelrath campaign maps." He bit the hardtack with professional focus. He said the ones who stop to think are the dangerous ones. The ones who stop to think. Draven had stopped to think. And somewhere in that thinking, in the space between the Valor intelligence reports and the Eastern Pass reconnaissance and the banner configuration on the Ravaran Ridge that didn't match his briefings, he was going to start pulling the thread. She did not know exactly when he would pull it far enough. She did not know exactly what he would find at the other end. She knew what she needed to do. She needed to be at the War Palace when the Crimson Summit was convened, because the summit was coming. Malric had told her it was the next move, that holding the valley gave them the negotiating position to demand the summit, and that Draven, recalculating in the siege line, would agree to it because a man who has just discovered his intelligence was managed is a man who needs information more than he needs a battlefield. She needed to be in that room, not because Malric needed her there. He was more than capable, because she had built the intelligence case against the Valor network from the inside across 5 years, and the summit was the moment when that case had its best chance of doing what it had been built to do. And because her son was in this war palace with a map and Draven's eyes and a 5-year-old's complete unawareness of what was about to arrive. And she needed to be the one standing between those two facts when they finally occupied the same room. She picked up her pen. She began the response brief. And in the valley 3 miles away, the man who had destroyed her and rebuilt her, and who did not yet know what he had built, stood in the cold morning light of his siege line and looked at a banner configuration he didn't recognize and kept pulling at the thread that was going to unravel everything. He would reach the summit. He would ride down from his lines. He would see Malric descend the palace steps, and beside Malric, holding the man's hand with the ease of a child who has never needed to question whether that hand would hold. A boy, with Draven's eyes. And the world the Alpha King had constructed on the grave of his choices would crack from the center outward, and every kingdom on the continent would feel the fracture, and there would be nothing left to do but go all the way through what had been set in motion the night Nyra Vale walked out of the throne chamber and did not look back. The Crimson Summit was Malric's idea and Draven's necessity, which meant both men arrived at the negotiating table already knowing the other had not come to negotiate. The War Palace at Duskavar opened its formal hall for the occasion, a vast room with stone floors and high windows that let in the cold light of the northern afternoon without any of the warmth. No chandeliers, no gold. The ceiling was exposed timber, dark with age, and the walls held maps instead of tapestries. It was a room that said, "We do not confuse ceremony with significance." Draven walked into it with 6 of his commanders and the specific posture of a man who had spent 2 weeks in a siege line recalculating every piece of intelligence he thought he owned. He looked different than Nyra remembered. She registered this from her position at the far end of the room, off to the side, officially present as Malric's strategic advisor, technically peripheral, actually the person in the room who had the most complete picture of what was happening and why. She had dressed for function, dark northern wool, the silver wolf insignia of her Ravaran advisory rank on her collar, her hair back and out of the way. She had made no decision about how she would look when he saw her. There was no version of this moment she could control through appearance. She watched him come through the entrance. He had always been physically present in a way that was difficult to account for. Not large exactly, but dense. The kind of person who occupied space with a completeness that made the room reorganize itself around him without his doing anything deliberate. That was still true. What was different was something around the eyes. A specific quality of vigilance that had not been there 4 years ago, or had been there but differently calibrated. This was not the alertness of a man who was looking for opportunities. This was the alertness of a man who had recently been reminded that the ground beneath him was not as solid as he had built his empire assuming. He entered the room. He looked across it. He found her. She had known he would find her immediately. He had always been able to locate her in a room without appearing to search. She had once considered this a quality of their bond. She now cataloged it as a tactical characteristic of a man trained to always know where the relevant variables were. His expression did not change. Neither did hers. Malric stepped forward from the Ravaran side, and the 2 rulers faced each other across 15 feet of cold stone floor and the weight of everything between them. "Thorn," Malric said. "Duskbane." Draven's voice was exactly as she remembered it. Deep, unhurried, the voice of a man who had never needed volume to be heard. "You wanted a summit." "I wanted a conversation that didn't require either of us to bury soldiers afterward." "Generous." Draven's gaze moved briefly across the Ravarine contingent, cataloging, and then it came back to Malric's face. "Your valley position was better than my intelligence suggested." "Your intelligence has a source problem." A beat. Draven said, "I'm aware." The 2 men looked at each other. Naira watched this exchange and understood exactly what it was. The specific shorthand of rulers who were both operating from incomplete information and were testing how much the other had already figured out. Malric knew about the Valor intelligence manipulation. She had briefed him on it months ago. What he didn't know was how much Draven had put together from inside the siege line and what he intended to do about it. What she needed was to be in this room until she understood Draven's internal position clearly enough to advise Malric on whether the summit was a genuine opening or a tactical screen. What happened instead was that the door at the north end of the hall opened and a courier entered with a message on sealed Dominion paper, and Commander Velis took it to Draven, and Draven broke the seal and read it, and his face did something she had never seen it do in 4 years. He went blank. Not controlled, not composed. Blank. The specific emptiness of someone who has received information that has temporarily overloaded the processing capacity they rely on to function. He folded the paper. He looked up. His eyes went immediately to Malric and then, in the next half-second, to her, and what passed through his face in that half-second was not something she had words for. Recognition, calculation. Something that might have been, in another man, the early architecture of grief. "We need a recess," he said. Malric looked at him with the expression of a man reading a situation. "How long?" "1 hour." Malric glanced at Nira. She gave him the small nod that meant, give it to him. 1 hour, Malric said. That. She found out what was in the message from Kael, who found out from Velus, who was not trying to hide it because there was nothing about the message that Valor loyal elements in the Dominion were attempting to conceal. They were, in fact, counting on the message reaching exactly the people it needed to reach. The message said, a Dominion Council vote had been convened in Draven's absence. 7 of the 16 council members, all with Valor financial connections, had moved to formally recognize Seraphine's upcoming heir as the Dominion's primary succession line. Not Draven's named successor, Seraphine's heir. The language of the motion specifically excluded any claim from individuals of uncertain parentage currently residing in hostile territories. Uncertain parentage. Naira read Kael's summary of the message standing in the corridor outside the main hall, and she stayed very still while the full shape of it arranged itself in front of her. It was elegant. She gave them that. Seraphine's people had read the tactical situation with enough accuracy to understand that the summit created a window, a moment where Draven was away from the capital, engaged in direct military negotiations, with his attention fully on Rivarin, a moment where the council could be moved before he was back in the room to prevent it. The motion itself was nearly undoable once formally recorded. Succession law was the most deeply entrenched legal architecture in the Dominion system. It had been built to be resistant to individual reversal precisely because reversible succession was how empires fell into civil war. The only way to undo a formally recorded succession motion was a full council reversal with a supermajority, which required the kind of political capital that took years to build and could not be assembled from a war table in Rivarin. They had not moved to remove Draven. They were smarter than that. They had moved to remove the one thing that could have given him a reason to choose differently. Lucienne. She moved, not running. Running attracted attention, and she needed the next 4 minutes of attention-free movement. She walked with the pace of someone who was going somewhere with a clear purpose and nothing urgent about it, which was a lie her body performed while her mind worked the problem at a speed she could not afford to show. The secondary command room. She needed to reach the secondary command room because Lucian was there with one of Malric's trusted staff, and the secondary command room had the north exit that connected directly to the lower garrison where Kael's division was housed. Because if Seraphine's people were moving on the council, they had already moved on the pieces they needed to move on the ground. That was how this family operated. She had compiled the dossier. She knew their pattern. Political motion first to create the legal architecture. Then the physical action, which the legal architecture would retrospectively justify. The physical action was Lucienne. She turned the corner into the passage that led to the secondary command room and came face to face with 2 men she did not recognize who were standing in a location that had no casual explanation. They were dressed in civilian clothing. They had Valor silver. She knew this because she had described Valor silver to enough people in enough briefings that she could identify the specific weight and color of the coins in a man's pocket by the way it made his coat hang. She did not break stride. She said, as she passed them, "The council session is in the East Wing, second corridor on your left." She kept walking. She heard them hesitate behind her. The specific quality of a pause that meant they were recalibrating, reconsidering whether she was what they were looking for or a misdirection. She had given them a task. Humans given a task by someone who spoke with authority tended to briefly follow the task before questioning the authority. She had approximately 30 seconds. She reached the secondary command room door and opened it and came through and closed it behind her. Lucian looked up from his position at the table. The staff member was at the window. His name was Oren. 30 years old, one of Malric's people since before Naira arrived. A man she had vetted personally and trusted about as much as she trusted anyone who was not Malric or Kael. "Oren," she said, "north exit, now." He read her face and did not ask questions. Lucien got to his feet. "What? Walk with me. Don't run. Can you do that?" He looked at her for 1 second with those winter gray eyes, and she watched him make the calculation. Reading her, reading the room, reading the specific texture of the urgency she was managing without showing, and then he said, "Yes." "Good. Come on." They went through the north exit into the lower corridor, and she kept them moving with the specific unhurried pace of people who belonged exactly where they were, which was the most effective disguise available in an environment where everyone already knew each other and strangers were the anomaly. She needed to get him to Kael's division. She needed to get him behind men she trusted with numbers she trusted, and she needed to do it without triggering whatever the Valor people in this palace had been positioned to do, because triggering them before she understood their full deployment was the one thing she could not afford. They moved. Prompt. Draven sat in the recess room alone with the folded paper and the specific quality of silence that follows the arrival of information that changes the topology of everything you thought you understood. He had known the Valor Council motion was a possibility. He had run this scenario, in the abstract, the way he ran all scenarios, as a thing that could happen and that required planning. He had believed his political capital was sufficient to prevent it. He had believed that the specific combination of his physical presence in the capital and Seraphine's need for his continued authority made the motion too dangerous for her family to execute while he was still king in any functional sense. He had believed incorrectly. He put the paper down and looked at the wall and did what he did when the architecture of a situation changed faster than his planning could accommodate. He went back to first principles. What did he actually know? He knew the Valor intelligence on Ravaran had been managed. He had figured this out in the siege line and had begun building a counterpicture from the assets he was personally certain of. The counterpicture was incomplete, but it was enough to tell him that the valley defense was better resourced than he had been told, that the eastern supply routes were more sophisticated than his briefings indicated, and that someone inside Ravaran had been feeding the Valor Network's analysts a specifically shaped version of the territory's military capacity for long enough to create a coherent false picture. That someone had to be former Dominion. There was no one in Ravaran who had enough understanding of his analytical methodology to shape information for his specific blind spots. He knew that Naira Vale was in this palace. He had seen her from across the hall, and he had managed his reaction to the information of her, and now he was sitting with it in the recess room, and he was letting himself actually look at it rather than managing it from a distance. She was here. She was alive. She was functioning at a senior advisory level inside Malric Duskbane's strategic structure, which meant she had spent 5 years building something inside enemy territory rather than disappearing. He had expected, he understood now, examining the expectation honestly, he had expected her to either return to the borderlands and the quiet life available to women of her original rank, or to have been absorbed into some other circumstance that removed her from the political landscape he operated in. He had not expected her to become the intelligence architecture his enemies were using to outthink him. He had not expected her to be here. And he had not expected, when he walked through that door and his eyes found her across the hall, to feel what he felt. He was not going to examine that in this room. He needed to think about the child. The council motion referenced individuals of uncertain parentage currently residing in hostile territories. The language was specific. He had read it 3 times, and each reading confirmed that the language was specific in a way that required its authors to have specific information. There had to be something in Revarin that the Valor network knew about and that Draven himself did not, something that required this particular legal architecture. He stood. He picked up the paper. He walked back to the main hall. Malric was standing at the window when Draven came through the door. The Revarin contingent had reduced itself. The advisors had stepped out, leaving Malric and 2 of his commanders in Nyra's empty chair at the far end of the table. Draven looked at the empty chair. "Where is she?" he said. Malric turned from the window. "My advisor has a matter to attend to." "Where is she?" Malric held his gaze with the evenness of a man who had already decided how much of the truth he was going to give and was simply waiting for the question to catch up. "She's with my staff," he said. "There was a security concern." Draven's jaw tightened by a fraction. "What kind of security concern?" "The kind that arrived with your delegation." The word landed exactly the way it was meant to. Draven went still in the way a man goes still when something confirms a suspicion he was hoping was wrong. "Valor people," he said. 2 of them were identified in the interior corridors, in positions they had no business being in. Draven set the folded paper on the table with a precision that was not gentleness. He said, "The council, motion. I've been briefed on it." "Of course you have." His voice was flat. "She briefed you." "Nyra briefed my council on the Valor network's activity pattern months ago. This is consistent with what she told us to expect." Draven looked at the paper on the table for a long moment. "She told you to expect a succession motion during the summit," he said. "Yes. And she told you, before or after she helped you construct the eastern supply routes that my intelligence reports failed to identify." Malric said nothing, which was its own answer. Draven looked up from the paper. The intelligence picture, the valley defense, the supply lines. That was her. "She has been a member of my advisory council for 4 years. She was my intelligence officer for 4 years before that." "I know," Malric said. "That's why she's effective." Something moved across Draven's face. Not anger. Anger was too simple for what this was. It was the specific expression of a man processing the distance between the decision he had made 5 years ago and the architecture of consequence that decision had built without his knowledge or consent. "Seraphine's people," he said. "The concern in the interior corridors. What specifically were they positioned to do?" Malric looked at him. "What," Draven said, "were they positioned to do?" "We believe the target was a specific individual currently under my protection." Draven's voice was very quiet when he said, "Who?" The door at the north end of the hall opened. Nyra came through it. She came through it with a child beside her, and one of Malric's garrison soldiers 2 steps behind, and the specific quality of tension in her body was the kind that Draven had only seen from her once before. At the throne chamber, the night he destroyed her, that particular controlled stillness of a person managing something catastrophic without letting the management show. She brought the child to Malric's side, and she said something to the garrison soldier who stepped back to the wall, and then she stood at the table's edge and she looked at Draven. He looked at the child. The child looked back. The hall was very quiet, the kind of quiet that contains many things pressing against it from both sides. Draven looked at the boy's eyes. He had his mother's face, her bone structure, the specific set of her jaw, the particular quality of stillness she carried that was not coldness but presence, the sense that the person inside was paying full attention. But the eyes, light gray, almost colorless, like winter sky over open water. He knew those eyes. He had seen them in the mirror every morning for 15 years. The room did not tilt. He was not a man who let rooms tilt, but something in the deep foundation of what he understood to be true about his own history shifted, ground against itself, and settled into a new configuration that could not be returned to what it had been. He looked at Nyra. She looked back at him with the expression she had worn that night in the throne chamber, not devastation, not fury. The expression of a person who has received confirmation of something they already knew and had been hoping to be wrong about. except reversed, except aimed at him. "How long?" he said. Her voice was level. "He'll be 6 in the spring." The arithmetic was immediate and brutal. He did not need to work it out because it worked itself out without his consent. The timeline, the dates, the sequence of events, and what had been true in the months before the throne chamber that he had not known and that she had been managing alone. "You knew," he said. "Before. I found out 6 weeks before the announcement. And you didn't—" He stopped. He looked at the table. He looked at the ceiling. He made himself look at her. "Why?" "Because telling you would have made me a political problem that your new alliance couldn't afford to have exist." Her voice did not shake. It was the voice of someone who had asked herself this question 5 years ago and had arrived at an answer she was still living inside. "Because Seraphine's family handles political problems efficiently, and because you had already decided. I would have—" "What?" The word cut. Not loud, precise. "What would you have done? Cancelled the Valor Alliance because of information I brought you, made me the reason your empire's eastern consolidation failed, spent the rest of your reign managing the political fallout of a decision that looked like weakness from the outside because it was made from love on the inside." She looked at him without flinching. "You know what you would have done. You would have made the same choice and hated yourself more for it, and he would have grown up inside that calculation." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything that was true about what she had just said. Draven looked at the boy. The boy had not moved. He stood beside Malric with the stillness of a child who was paying very careful attention to a situation he did not yet have all the context for, and the quality of that attention, the specificity of it, the patience of it, was something Draven recognized from inside himself. He said, "What is his name?" Nira said, "Lucien." Malric, who had been watching this exchange with the expression of a man who was present but understood this was not his moment, put a hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. The gesture was not performed. It was the automatic response of a person whose relationship with the child was old enough to be physical habit. Draven watched that hand. Something inside him that had been controlled and managed and sealed behind 15 years of empire broke along a line he had not known was there. He said, "You raised him here." "I raised him here," Nera said, "where it was safe to raise him. With him." The word was not accusation. It was something rawer than accusation. It was the sound of a man understanding the full dimension of what he gave up. Malric said, "With people who chose to be here." Draven looked at Malric. The two men looked at each other, and in that look was the specific communication of rivals who have arrived at a truth that neither of them can walk backward from. Malric had given this child what Draven had not. Not because Malric was better, because Draven had not been present to give it, and Malric had been. That distinction, to a man built on the premise that what mattered was the outcome, was insufficient. That distinction, to a father standing in a war palace looking at his son for the first time, was unbearable. He was going to carry that. That was what he understood in that moment. He was going to carry it the way the scar on Malric's left arm from some early campaign carried its story, permanently, without drama, as a feature of the landscape of being alive. The door crashed open. Not a courier, not a guard. Varos Valor, Seraphine's cousin. 40 years old, built like a siege weapon, one of the most effective field commanders in the Dominion's Western Division, and one of the people Naira had specifically flagged in her Valor dossier as operationally dangerous. He came through the door with 4 soldiers behind him, and the specific energy of a man who had calculated that the time for political motion was finished, and the time for physical resolution had arrived. "This summit," Varos said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who considered the room already settled, "is over." Draven turned. Malric's hand moved from Lucien's shoulder to a position between the child and Varos without any apparent interruption of movement. Varos looked across the room, and his gaze went directly to the boy with the uncanny accuracy of someone who had been briefed on exactly who and what he was looking for. "The child," he said, "is coming with me under council authority. The succession motion is recorded. His presence in this territory constitutes a political claim that the council has already resolved." Draven said, "Stand down." My king. Varros said the title with the specific inflection of a man who was no longer certain the title applied. The council has spoken. You are 600 miles from the capital, and the legal process has been completed. Whatever you decide in this room today has no force against a formal succession record. I said stand down. The boy is a liability that the Valor bloodline cannot allow to— If you say one more word about my son, Draven said, I will end this conversation permanently. The room held. Varros looked at him, calculating, reading the situation with the speed of a man who had survived long enough in imperial politics to know when a line had been crossed that was not coming back. He miscalculated. He said, You have no legal authority to cheat. Draven moved. The distance between them was 15 feet. He covered it in the time it takes a decision to finish forming, and he had Varros by the collar before the man's guards had completed their reach for their weapons. And what Draven did then was not a king's action or general's action, but a father's action, which was the most dangerous kind because it carried none of the usual restraint. He drove Varros against the wall. You came into this palace, he said, his voice down to the register that meant everything above the surface had been stripped away, and what was left was the actual thing underneath. To take my child. Under whose authority? Varros's neck was red. The council does not exist right now. Right now there is this room, and you and me, and you are going to tell me exactly who gave the execution order and how many assets are currently deployed in this building. You came in here with 4 men. You came in here with 4 men and a council document, and you planned to walk out with a 6-year-old child, so you had something to fall back on if I was in this room, which means you have something outside if I wasn't. He tightened his grip. How many? Varros said nothing. Nira said from across the room, 8. They entered with your delegation, 4 in the lower corridor, 2 at the north exit, 2 in the exterior approach. The north exit pair are already contained. Kael's people got there first. The lower corridor 4 are the active risk. Draven looked at her. She had been running numbers the entire time. While he was standing in the recess room having the worst hour of his adult life, she had been doing the actual work. She had Lucian clear and Kael's people deployed before he even understood the full shape of what was happening. She met his eyes across the room. What passed between them in that moment had no clean name. It was not reconciliation. It was not forgiveness. It was the specific recognition between 2 people who have operated at the same level for a long time, who have spent years on opposite sides of a problem they both understood completely, and who are in the same room for the first time. He turned back to Varros. Tell your men in the lower corridor to stand down, he said, or I will go down there myself, and this summit will end in a way that the council will spend the next decade explaining. Varros looked at him. He was a man who had spent a long career reading the difference between a king performing anger and a king who had arrived somewhere past performance. He read the difference now. He told his men to stand down. What? The hours that followed were the kind that required people to function at a precision that the preceding catastrophe made nearly impossible. Malric's garrison secured the lower corridor. Kael handled the exterior approach with the efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this scenario and had positioned for it without being asked. Draven's personal guard, the 3 men he trusted completely and not through the Valor vetting process, took Varros into custody. Nira briefed Malric's senior staff on the complete Valor dossier in the secondary command room while Draven sat across the hall with the folded paper and the weight of his miscalculation and the image of his son standing beside another man with the ease of a child who had never needed to be uncertain about whether that hand would hold. At some point, Lucian was brought back to the secondary room. Nira was in the middle of the briefing when it happened, and she registered his arrival with the peripheral awareness she maintained even in full professional focus. The specific sound of his footsteps, the way the room's energy shifted when he came in, the fact that Malric stayed close but not crowding. The briefing concluded. She found Draven in the main hall. He was standing at the window. He had his back to the room. The last light of the afternoon was doing something to the quality of the cold outside, making it visible, the way cold sometimes became visible in the transition from afternoon to evening, the air itself taking on a quality of density. She stood in the room and looked at his back. She said, He's safe. Your men have the lower corridor. Varos is contained. I know. His voice was different from the one he had used in the recess room. Flatter. The voice of a man who has gotten to the other side of a crisis and is standing in what it left behind. I've been informed. Silence. She said, the council motion is the immediate problem. Varos being detained doesn't undo the legal record. No. He turned. He looked at her. Nothing undoes the last 5 years. She held his gaze. No, she said. Nothing does. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression she had not seen from him before. Not the composed authority, not the strategic assessment, not even the specific rawness of the moment in the hall when he first understood what Lucien was. Something that looked underneath all the architecture he had built, like a man in the first stage of understanding the shape of what he had done and what it had cost. She did not help him with it. She had spent 5 years finding the shape of what he had done and what it had cost, and she had done that work alone, and it was not her job to make his version of it easier. He said, tell me what you need to bring Seraphine down. She looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she said, the council records, the original Valor financial ledgers that document the cash flows to the 7 council members who voted for the motion. Testimony from Varos about the specific chain of authorization, who gave the order, when, in what format. And your word, given publicly and on the record, that the succession motion was fraudulent and that you have a living heir. My word publicly given means civil war. The Valor-controlled armies will revolt whether you give the word or not. Varos being detained ends the Valor pretense of working within your authority. They know that. Their next move is military, regardless of what you say in this hall tonight. She held his eyes. The question is whether you get ahead of it or whether it happens to you. He was quiet. She said, the question is whether you are still making the same calculation you made 5 years ago or whether something has changed. He looked at her. She looked back. She did not fill the silence with anything softer because there was nothing softer available and nothing softer that would have been honest. He said, where is he now? Secondary command room. With Malric. With Malric and Kael's garrison and 6 people I trust specifically. He nodded. He looked at the window. He said, I want to speak to him. She breathed through the thing that moved through her at those words. The complicated, permanent, never quite finished feeling of a person who has protected something alone for a long time and is now standing at the threshold of not doing that alone anymore. She said, he doesn't know who you are. I know. You are a stranger to him. He will treat you like one. I know. And I will be there. He said, I wouldn't expect anything else. She looked at him for a moment longer. She did not search his face for the man she had loved because that man was both still there and not the point. The point was the man in front of her and what he was going to do next, and whether those actions would be the kind that built something instead of the kind that burned it. She said, come with me. She turned toward the north corridor. He followed. And behind him, the empty hall held the folded paper and the last of the afternoon light, and the shape of a choice that had already made itself in the only place choices actually got made, in the specific moment when a man understood, finally, that everything he had sacrificed power to protect was less real than the thing he had sacrificed to build it. There was no going back. There was only the corridor ahead, and the room at the end of it, and the boy inside who did not yet know his name was going to change the shape of an empire. And the man behind her who was going to have to become something he had never been in order to deserve what came next. The secondary command room smelled like candle wax and old maps, and the specific dusty cold of a room that worked too hard to bother with comfort. Lucien was at the table when they came through the door. He had his smaller map spread in front of him and a piece of charcoal in his hand, and he was marking something with the focused precision of a person who had learned that precision was its own form of control over uncertain situations. Malric was in the chair to his left, not hovering, just present in the specific way he was always present, occupying space without demanding anything from it. Kael stood at the room's far wall with 2 garrison soldiers and the expression of a man who had already run the threat assessment on every person in this room and had filed Draven Thorn at the top of it. Lucien looked up when the door opened. He looked at his mother first, the reflex of a child whose first read on any new situation was to check the face of the person he trusted most. Naira gave him nothing alarmed. He registered this, and then he looked at the man behind her. He looked at Draven for a long time. Children that age were supposed to be bad at concealing reaction. Lucien had grown up in a military compound full of serious people who had never spoken down to him and had never pretended that expressions were not information. And he had learned early that his face was something he could choose to manage or choose to open. He chose, in this moment, to stay neutral, to keep his expression as a question rather than a conclusion. He said, "You're the one from the hall." Draven said, "Yes." "You were at the summit table." Lucian looked at him with those gray eyes that were going to be, Nira understood with a physical completeness she could not prevent, the thing that undid her every time she looked at them for the rest of her life. "You're the Dominion King." "I am." Lucian looked at his map, then back at Draven. "Your cavalry didn't advance yesterday." Draven was quiet for a moment. "No." "Why?" "Because sometimes not moving is the stronger position." Lucian considered this. He set the charcoal down. He looked at the man in front of him with an assessment that was not a child's assessment, or rather, it was exactly a child's assessment, which meant it was completely unfiltered by the need to perform sophistication or protect anyone's feelings. He said, "My mother doesn't like you." Nira said, "Lucian?" "That's not an insult," he said, not to her but to Draven. "She doesn't not like many people. She's usually just specific about what she thinks about someone. But you she doesn't like." He paused. "Which means you did something." Draven held the boy's gaze. He said, "I did." "To her?" "Yes." Another long look. Then Lucian said, "Are you going to fix it?" The room was very still. Draven said, "I'm going to try." Lucian picked up the charcoal. He looked at his map. He said, with the tone of someone returning to work after an adequate pause, "Okay." And he made a mark on the map that meant, apparently, that the conversation had reached its natural conclusion and he was moving on. Malric caught Nira's eyes over the boy's head. The look he gave her was not readable as any single thing. It was the look of a man who understood that the room had just shifted in a specific way, and that the shift was irreversible, and that irreversible shifts required a recalibration of everything downstream. She looked back at him. She said quietly enough for only Malric to hear, "How long do we have before Seraphine moves the army?" He said, "By my estimate, she already has." But the message confirming it arrived 40 minutes later, and it arrived in the specific format of bad news that has been running ahead of you the whole time and has finally stopped waiting for you to catch up. 3 of the Dominion's western divisions, all under Valor-appointed commanders, had broken from the main campaign formation and were moving not toward Reverin, but toward the capital. Not a retreat, a repositioning, the kind that happened when an army had received new orders from a new command authority and was in the process of demonstrating that the new authority was real. Seraphine had not waited for Varos to deliver the child. She had planned for Varos to fail. This was the part Nira had not fully mapped, had suspected, had included in her risk assessment as a contingency, but had not been able to confirm because the information would have required an asset inside Seraphine's personal staff that she did not have. The succession motion had not been the primary action, it had been the justification. The primary action was the army, and the army had been moving since before Varos walked through the summit door. She spread the message on the table, and she ran the numbers in her head, and the numbers were not good. 3 Western divisions meant approximately 45,000 soldiers. Draven's loyal forces in the field numbered the main Raverin campaign army, 60,000, but split between the siege line and the rear support positions, and some portion of those forces were now of uncertain loyalty, given the succession motion and the speed at which Valor-aligned officers had demonstrated they were capable of switching allegiances. Malric's Revarin forces were fresh, defended, and on home ground, but they were 30,000. The math did not favor a conventional military solution. She was still looking at the numbers when Draven came to stand at the other side of the table. He looked at the message. He looked at the deployment map she had pulled alongside it. He did the same calculation she had done, and she watched him do it, and she watched the moment when he arrived at the same conclusion. He said, "She moved before the summit." Yes. Which means the summit itself was a window for her, not for you. Naira looked at him. She needed you away from the capital and committed to a position while she moved the pieces that couldn't be moved with you watching. How long have you known this was possible? I flagged it as a risk 8 months ago. I didn't know the timeline or whether she'd actually execute it. People plan things they never do. She paused. Seraphine executes. He was quiet. She said, Varos was the cover. If he succeeded, she had the child and the succession was clean. If he failed, it didn't matter because the army was already moving and the legal record was already filed, and by the time you got back to the capital, she would have the physical infrastructure of power regardless of the paper. She was going to let me come home. She was going to let you come home to a capital she controlled with an army she commanded, and a council record that made her heir the legitimate succession line. Nira held his eyes. You would have been king, technically, with no heir of your own on the record, with Valor forces between you and any military option, with a wife who had spent 5 years building a structure inside your empire that you didn't see because you trusted her family's intelligence network to tell you what was real. Draven's jaw worked. She had compiled this picture across 5 years, and she had never once allowed herself to feel the specific dark satisfaction of delivering it to the person who had made it necessary. She did not allow herself to feel it now. The situation did not have room for satisfaction. The capital, he said. How long? If they're moving at campaign pace, 6 days to reach the outer walls. If Seraphine opens the gates, which she will, she has the garrison commanders, then there's no siege. They're inside within the week. And my loyal forces. Your loyal forces are currently receiving orders from Valor-appointed officers who are interpreting the succession motion as a legal transfer of command authority. She paused. How many of them follow you specifically rather than the legal structure? He looked at the map. She watched him do the calculation that was not a military calculation, the one where you assessed how much of your army was loyal to you as a person versus loyal to the institution you represented, and what the difference meant when the institution turned against you. He said, the 1st Division, General Rayeth. He's been with me since the Northern Consolidation, personal loyalty. He paused. 2nd Cavalry, Commander Aldris. Maybe half the rear support. He paused again. The siege line, if we move fast enough to reach them before the Valor officers do. Nira said, that's approximately 25,000 if you're optimistic. I'm never optimistic. Then call it 18. He looked at the map for a long time, then he said, combined with Malric's 30. She looked at him. He looked back. That's the ask, he said. It was not a question. That's the math, she said. And Malric, he is not going to commit 30,000 soldiers to a Dominion civil war because the math works out. She held his eyes. He's going to need a reason. What reason? Something that doesn't require him to trust you. A pause. Because he doesn't trust you. He has specific and well-founded reasons not to trust you, and 5 years of evidence that his judgment about you was accurate. Draven said, what does he need? She said, he needs to know that Lucien is the reason, not the alliance, not the strategic position, not what a Ravarin Dominion combined force means for the territorial balance going forward. She looked at him directly. He needs to know that you understand what you gave up and what he gave that you didn't, and that this is about the child and not about recovering your empire. Those aren't mutually exclusive. I know they're not. He knows they're not. But one of them has to be primary, and he needs to hear which one it is from you, and he needs to believe it. She picked up the message from the table and folded it. Can you make him believe it? Draven said, Can I? That's not a rhetorical question. He looked at her. She looked back. He said, I don't know. It was the most honest thing he had said to her in 5 years. Possibly the most honest thing he had said to her since the first year, when honest things had still felt possible between them before the empire got large enough to make honesty a luxury. She said, Then that's where we start, Jat. The conversation between Draven and Malrik happened in the main hall with no advisors and no commanders, and no one between them but the cold afternoon light and the weight of everything each of them knew about the other. Nira waited in the corridor with Kyle and did not pace because pacing was a luxury that communicated anxiety, and she needed to be past anxiety into something more operational. Kale said, not looking at her, "You believe him." She said, "I believe he's trying to." "That's not the same thing." "I know." She looked at the closed door. "It's what we have." Kyle was quiet for a moment. Then, "Malric's going to say yes." "You don't know that." "I know him. He's been making this decision for 5 years. He just didn't know the decision was forming. He shifted his weight. The boy. The way he is with the boy. That was never about strategy." Naira held that thought and did not examine it too closely, because examining it too closely would cost her something she needed to have available for what came next. She said, "How fast can you mobilize?" "Full division in 4 hours. Light cavalry in 90 minutes if I push them." "Push them." She turned from the door. "If Malric says yes, we need cavalry on the road before dark. We cannot let Valor forces reach the Dominion capital and consolidate the garrison. Once they're inside the walls and they have the armory and the council chamber, the cost of taking it back doubles." Kyle said, "And if Malric says no?" She said, "He's not going to say no." She said it with the specific flatness of a person who had committed to an outcome not because she was certain, but because the alternative was not supportable, and she had no space left for outcomes she couldn't work with. The door opened. Malric came through it first. She read his face in the half-second before he had arranged it, and what she saw in that half-second was the expression of a man who had made a decision that cost him something and was carrying that cost without flinching. Behind him, Draven. Draven looked like a man who had been asked to open a door inside himself that he had not opened in 15 years and had found that the hinges still worked. Malric looked at Naira. He said, "We ride at dusk." "What?" They hit the road with Kyle's light cavalry in the van and Malric's 3rd Division behind, and Draven's personal guard folded into the formation in the specific position of people who were being trusted with a specific radius and not beyond it. The sun was down and the road ahead was the dark northern variety that swallowed your horizon and gave you back nothing but the next 50 feet. Naira rode near the front of the formation because the front of the formation was where the decisions happened, and she intended to be present for decisions. Lucien was in the middle of the column with Oren and 2 of Kyle's most trusted soldiers, in a configuration that Naira had designed with the same methodology she applied to everything: layered, redundant, built to fail safely rather than fail catastrophically. She had explained the configuration to him before they rode. He had listened with the specific attention he brought to things he was going to be expected to follow precisely. Then he had said, "If something happens, I stay with Oren. Not Kyle, not you. Oren." "Yes." "Because Oren is the least likely to be targeted." She had looked at him. "Where did you get that?" Malric explained targeting priority last month. He said the people most worth protecting are usually not the people most visibly worth protecting. He paused. "You're visibly worth protecting. So am I, probably." "Oren isn't visible." She had not had a response to this that would have been adequate, so she had said, "Stay with Oren," and mounted her horse. The column rode through the first night and the second dawn, and the situation on the road changed the way battlefield situations always changed, faster than the planning accommodated, and in directions the planning had not anticipated. The first contact came from General Wraith's scouts, riding hard from the southeast with the particular urgency of men who had been covering ground at a pace that destroyed horses. Wraith's message was brief and specific in the way of a man who had learned that brevity was its own form of loyalty. It contained only what was essential and none of what wasn't. 3 words. Seraphine moved early. Naira read the message and looked at Draven. He read it and looked at the horizon. "How early?" he said. "The Western divisions aren't 6 days out." She folded the message. "They're 3. The number landed in the space between them and stayed there. 3 days meant Seraphine had accelerated the timeline, had received word of the summit's failure, of Varos's detention, and had pushed the Western forces past campaign pace into something that destroyed men and horses to gain time. It was the decision of someone who understood that the window was closing and had calculated that the cost of acceleration was less than the cost of being late. It was the right calculation. Draven said, "Roth can intercept. If he moves now." She was already working it, but Wraith's 1st Division alone against 3 Western divisions is suicidal. Yes. But if Wraith intercepts and holds the western approach long enough for Malric's force to swing around the southern pass, he pulled the road map from his coat and spread it across his saddle with the efficiency of a man who thought in maps. There, the Varos crossing. It's 3 miles out of the direct route, but it cuts 20 hours off the approach to the capital's southern gate. She looked at the map. She looked at it the way she had learned to look at maps, not for what was on them, but for what they implied about everything that was not. The Varos crossing was correct. It was also exactly the route she would have chosen if she were Seraphine's campaign commander and was trying to predict where a pursuing combined force would move. "It's the obvious move," she said. "It's the right move." "It might be both." She held his eyes. "If Seraphine's people have already positioned at the crossing, then we know the crossing is defended before we commit to it." He looked at the map. "Send scouts first, Wraith's light cavalry. They have better ground speed and they'll have the read within 6 hours. That's 6 hours we might not have. That's 6 hours of certainty we need to have." He rolled the map. "I'm not gambling this on obvious. Not anymore." She looked at him. He met her eyes. Something in the specific way he said it, "not anymore," settled in her chest and stayed there without requiring examination. It was not forgiveness. It was not the restoration of anything. It was the recognition of a change in a person she knew well enough to recognize change in, and the specific, complicated task of deciding what weight to give that recognition when the stakes of being wrong were as high as they currently were. She turned her horse and went to find Kael. The scouts came back in 4 hours instead of 6 because Wraith's light cavalry were exceptional at their work and because the intelligence was unambiguous enough to not require extended verification. The Varos crossing was defended. Heavily. Not just positioned, fortified. Seraphine's people had been at the crossing for at least 48 hours, which meant the defensive infrastructure had not been assembled in response to their movement. It had been assembled before the summit. Before Varos walked through the door, before any of it. It had been assembled because Seraphine had not planned for one escape route. She had planned for all of them. Naira received the scout report and held it, and let herself understand with the specific clarity that came after the last remaining uncertainty was removed, the full shape of what they were facing. Seraphine had not been reacting to Draven's choices. She had been building this for 3 years. The summit, the timing, the council motion, the Western divisions, the crossing. All of it had been assembled with the patience of someone who understood that the most durable power was the kind that looked, at the moment of execution, like it was inevitable, like it had always been the natural outcome, like the king's downfall was the logical conclusion of his own overreach rather than the product of a conspiracy that had been running in the walls of his empire for years. She had been inside this court. She had been breathing its air and learning its patterns, and the thing she had missed, the thing that had been running beneath everything she could see, was this. Naira stood with the scout report in her hand and felt the specific cold of that realization move through her. Then she set it aside and went to work. "The northern pass," she said, when she reached Draven and Malric at the forward position. She spread her map without preamble. It's not on the standard route maps because it collapsed during the winter flood 6 years ago, but it was rebuilt, partially. Enough for cavalry in single file and infantry at reduced pace. She put her finger on the position. It adds 18 hours. It also puts us at the capital's eastern gate, which is the only approach that isn't currently in Seraphine's tactical picture because it's not in anyone's tactical picture. Malric said, "How do you know it was rebuilt?" "Because I read the infrastructure reports from the Northern Territorial Survey before I left." She looked at the map. "Seraphine's people have my intelligence work on Raverin. They don't have my intelligence work on the Dominion, because that was in the files I took with me when I crossed the border." Draven looked at the map. He said, "The Eastern Gate is minimal garrison. 200 soldiers, ceremonial function." "Yes. We come through the northern pass at the Eastern Gate with a combined force, and Seraphine's main army is at the Varos crossing waiting for a column that isn't coming." "Yes." She looked at him. "She gets word we're not at the crossing, and she turns the army around." "How long?" 6 hours to turn a force that size. 8 if the commanders are Valor appointed and need the order confirmed twice. He paused. "We have the capital in the time between." Malric said, 18 hours through a collapsed pass in the dark. Nira said, "The pass holds. I've had it verified." Kale said, "By who?" "By the Northern Survey engineers whose contact information was in the territorial reports." She looked at him. "I contacted them 3 months ago when I first identified this scenario as a possibility." Silence. Malric looked at her with an expression that contained, at its base, something that looked like the specific recognition a person felt when they understood they had been consistently underestimating someone. Kale said, "She planned for this 3 months ago." Malric said, "She planned for everything that matters 3 months ago." He paused. "Or 5 years ago." Nira said, "The pass. Yes or no. We need to be moving in the next hour." Malric looked at Draven. Draven looked at Nira. He said, "Yes." Awant. The northern pass was everything she had told them it was, and nothing that telling had prepared them for. It was dark, and it was narrow, and it was cold in the specific way of compressed stone that had held cold for centuries, and was not inclined to release it for the convenience of an army. The horses did not like it. Several of the soldiers made the particular sounds of people managing a fear response through physical pressure on the jaw. Kyle rode near the front and did not make sounds but held his shoulders at the specific angle of a man who was staying inside his training by main effort. Nira rode near the middle of the column and focused on the ground ahead and the specific rhythms that moving through a confined space in darkness required. Behind her, she was aware of Lucian. She was always aware of Lucian. Had been since the moment she understood he was real. A specific, constant background frequency of awareness that operated regardless of what she was doing with the rest of her attention. He was with Orin. He was doing the things she had told him to do. She knew this without checking because not checking was the discipline that allowed her to function, and functioning was what he needed from her. What she had not accounted for was that he would handle the pass better than most of the adults. She found this out from Orin when they cleared the northern end of the pass with the first gray light of morning beginning in the east, and Orin, who was the most unflappable person she knew, came to ride beside her with the expression of someone who had something to report. "He sang," Orin said. She looked at him. "He what?" "In the pass. When the horses started getting difficult, he started singing. Something low, not loud, just present. And the horses settled." Orin paused. "So did the men near him." Nira looked at the road ahead. She said, "What was he singing?" "I don't know the song." She knew the song. It was something she had sung to him when he was an infant in the Kelhor settlement during the first winter, when the heating was unreliable and the cold came through the walls, and she had needed to give him something that had warmth in it. She had not known she was teaching him anything. She had been trying to keep herself steady. She looked at the road. She kept riding. Set. The capital of Arendor announced itself through smoke before sight. Not the smoke of the city, the smoke of fires that had been set deliberately in the specific pattern of a siege preparation that was also a message. We are already here, and we have already begun making decisions about what stands and what doesn't. Nira pulled her horse up at the ridge above the eastern approach and looked at the capital's skyline, with the dawn coming full now in the east, and the smoke moving against it. Draven rode up beside her. He looked at his capital burning. She did not look at his face. She had learned, years ago, that there were things she did not need to see to understand, and whatever was happening in his expression right now was one of them. She understood it from the quality of his silence, the specific density of a man looking at the thing he spent his life building and watching someone else light it. She said, "The Eastern Gate is holding. Wraith confirmed it an hour ago." He said, "How much of the city?" 3 districts in the outer ring. The inner city is intact. The palace is intact. She paused. The armory is compromised. Seraphine's people got to it before Wraith could position. The armory. His voice was flat. Yes. Which means the garrison that's still loyal is now fighting with what they had on them. Yes. He looked at the smoke. She said, "We have 40 minutes before Seraphine's force at the Varos crossing gets word we're not there and starts turning around. 40 minutes to get through the eastern gate, get Wraith's forces in a coordinated position, and give Malric's division time to come up through the city's southern approach." She looked at him. "We need to move." He did not move. She said, "Draven." Said, "The council chamber." "What?" "The council chamber will be where Seraphine is, not with the army. Seraphine doesn't run armies. She runs councils." He turned his horse. "If we take the army and the city, and we don't take the council chamber, she records another motion before we reach the inner gate, and we fight this battle again in 6 months with a different legal framework." She looked at him. He said, "She needs to be in the room where the succession motion was recorded, recanting it publicly before this day ends, or we win the battle and lose the war." She said, "The council chamber is in the inner city. The inner city is 3 layers of urban fighting from the eastern gate. I know where the council chamber is." "With what force?" He looked at her. She looked back. He said, "Myself, 8 personal guard, you. That's... The main force pushes through the outer approaches and holds Seraphine's army from the south. They don't need me for that. They need Malric and Kyle and Ryeth. What needs me is the council chamber." He held her eyes. "And what needs you is the documentation you're carrying." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "If Seraphine has personal guards in the council corridor, she does. Then 9 people and documentation isn't. It's what we have, and it's what the situation requires." He said it exactly the way he had said the siege line order 3 days ago, in the summit hall. Without volume, without additional force, just exactly the same, the register that communicated that the conversation was done. She breathed through the specific cold of the calculation. Then she said, "Lucien stays with Kyle." "Yes." "Malric's people hold the eastern approach until Wrath's division comes through." "Yes." "We go in through the servants' corridor on the eastern wall. There's a passage that connects directly to the council antechamber. It's not on the public palace maps." He looked at her. She said, "I memorized the palace infrastructure in my 2nd year. I didn't know why. I know now." His jaw moved. "Of course you did." She turned her horse. She rode down toward Kyle's position, and she found Lucien, and she stopped beside him, and he looked up at her with those gray eyes and the morning light in them, and she looked at him for 3 seconds that contained everything she could not say in 3 seconds, and then she said, "Stay with Kyle. Do what he tells you." He said, "Are you coming back?" She said, "Yes." He said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because I made you a promise." He held her eyes the way children hold eyes when they are deciding whether to accept an answer as sufficient. He decided. He said, "Okay." She turned her horse before she could look at him for 1 more second, because 1 more second would cost her something she needed. She rode back to Draven. She said, "Ready." He said, "Ready." They rode toward the eastern gate with the smoke rising above the city. They were about to take back, and the dawn coming full and cold, and the 40 minutes already spending themselves against the merciless arithmetic of what the next few hours were going to require. The city swallowed them. The streets of Arendor in the grip of Seraphine's early consolidation were not the streets Naira had known in 4 years of court life. They were the same geography wearing a different face, the buildings identical, and the people absent from them in the way people were absent from public space when the danger was real rather than theoretical. She navigated from memory, which was both faster and more accurate than looking, and she led Draven's 8-man guard through the servant passages and the maintenance corridors, and the specific architectural logic of a palace she had mapped in her head during 2 years of professional paranoia that had felt, at the time, like thoroughness. They came up through the eastern wall passage into the council antechamber to find 3 of Seraphine's personal guard standing in the corridor between them and the council chamber door. No conversation, no challenge. The guards moved to engage, and Draven's personal soldiers handled it with the efficiency of men who had been waiting through 3 days of riding to do something that required their actual function. 40 seconds. The corridor was clear. Naira moved past the result of it without looking at it, which was not because she was not affected, but because being affected was not currently scheduled. She reached the council chamber door. She put her hand on it. She breathed. She pushed it open. Seraphine Valor stood at the head of the council table. 6 of the remaining council members were present. They had been in session. Documents on the table, the specific arrangement of people caught in the middle of something they had not expected to be interrupted in. Seraphine looked at the door. She looked at Naira. She looked at Draven behind her. Her expression did not break. Naira had to give her that. It did not break, and it did not perform composure because it was already composed, already arranged in the specific architecture of a woman who had spent her entire adult life understanding that the moment you were most afraid was the moment your face most needed to communicate something else. She said, "You took the northern pass." Naira said, "Yes." A beat. Seraphine looked at Draven. "The western force is 3 hours from the Varos crossing. When they get word, they'll turn around," Draven said. "And by the time they reach the city, you'll have already given the council a full accounting." "Of what?" "Of everything." He walked into the room. He walked to the table and he set both hands on its surface, and he looked at Seraphine with the expression of a man who has run out of the specific kind of patience that permits complexity and has arrived at a place where only simplicity remains. The Valor financial connections to the council members, the assassination orders, the intelligence manipulation, the Reveran accounts. He looked at her. All of it, recorded, formally, in this room. Seraphine looked at Naira. "You compiled it," she said. Naira said, 5 years. Something moved across Seraphine's face. Not fear. This woman was not afraid in the conventional sense, any more than Draven was afraid in the conventional sense. It was something more specific. The expression of a person who understood that they had been outmaneuvered not in the battle but in the preparation for it, which was the only place that actually mattered. She said, "I had her hunted through the northern wilderness while she was carrying your child. You understand that?" Draven said, "I understand it. And you're going to make a full accounting, today, in this room." Seraphine looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the council members seated around the table, 6 men who had been her instruments and who were now very carefully not looking at either her or the king, which was the specific posture of people who were in the process of reconsidering their investments. She looked back at Draven, and she said, "What if I don't?" The question sat in the room like a lit match. Draven reached into his coat. He pulled out the ceremonial blade that Naira recognized with a specific cold precision. The same blade he had worn the night he rejected her. The same blade that had the thorn crest on the handle and that was present at formal imperial proceedings as a symbol of the king's authority and the king's judgment. He set it on the table between them. He said, "Then I use my judgment." The room held. Every person in it understood what was happening. The council members understood. Seraphine's remaining guard in the corridor outside understood. The thin walls of the Empire's legal structure understood. Seraphine looked at the blade. She looked at Draven. She looked, finally, at Naira. And in that look was something that Naira had not expected and did not know what to do with. Recognition. Not of an enemy, of a peer. The specific acknowledgement between 2 people who had both spent years building something inside the same system and had arrived at this room from opposite sides of it. She said, "You're going to win." Naira said, "Yes." She said, "And then what?" Naira said, "Then we rebuild what you broke." Seraphine looked at the blade on the table for a long time. Outside, the sounds of the city, the battle moving through the outer rings, the specific chaotic percussion of urban combat, the voices of soldiers whose loyalty had been tested and was now being demonstrated through action. Inside, the council chamber waited. And the moment before Seraphine moved, before she reached for the documents or the door or the specific outcome that the next 3 seconds would determine, sat on the edge of everything like a held breath, a kingdom on one side, a reckoning on the other. And every choice that had ever been made in this room by every person who had ever sat in these chairs, pressing down on the next 3 seconds with the full accumulated weight of what power cost and what it was worth, and what happened when the two stopped being the same number. Seraphine reached for the documents, not the door, not the guard she no longer had. The documents, the thick formal ledgers that had been open on the council table when Naira and Draven walked through the door, the records of the succession motion and the council votes and the financial architecture that had been running beneath the Dominion for 3 years like water beneath ice. She pulled them toward herself. She looked at Draven. She said, "You want a full accounting? You'll have it." The room breathed. Nira watched Seraphine's hands on the documents and ran the threat assessment in the time it took to draw one breath, whether this was compliance or the first move of something else, whether the 6 council members at the table were armed, whether the corridor behind them had been reinforced in the minutes since they cleared it. She concluded, compliance, conditionally. Not because Seraphine had surrendered, but because Seraphine was a woman who understood that a battle lost on one front could be reconfigured on another, and that the configuration available to her right now was the accounting, giving it cleanly, giving it completely, and creating in the giving a specific kind of record that served her interests differently than refusal would. She was not capitulating. She was repositioning. Nira understood this because she would have done the same. She let it happen anyway, because the accounting was real regardless of Seraphine's motive for providing it, and real documentation in a formal council record was the only thing that would hold against the next challenge. And there would be a next challenge. And this was how you built something that survived them. Draven took the chair at the head of the table. He did not sit in it the way he had always sat in chairs of authority, with the particular occupying density of a man who understood that furniture was also a statement. He sat in it the way a person sits when they are tired in a way that sleep does not fix, and when they are doing what needs doing because it needs doing, and not because it confirms anything they believe about themselves. Naira stood at his left and began setting out the documents she had carried from Raverin. 5 years of compiled intelligence, financial cross-references, the specific paper trail of the Vylor network's reach into Dominion institutions, with the systematic precision of someone who had organized this archive in her head long before she organized it on a table. The accounting took 4 hours. Osprant. Outside the palace, the city resolved itself. Not cleanly. Urban combat never resolved cleanly. It ended in increments, district by district, block by block, in the specific exhausted way of people who have been fighting at close range and have run out of the particular energy that close-range fighting required and have arrived at a mutual understanding that continuing costs more than stopping. Malric's forces came through the southern approach, and Wraith's loyal division held the eastern perimeter, and Kael's cavalry swept the outer ring in a coordinated movement that Naira had designed on paper in the secondary command room, and that was being executed, from what the runners reported, with a fidelity to the design that she would have found satisfying under any other circumstances. The Valor-commanded western divisions arrived at the capital's outer walls to find the gates held, and the garrison in the process of being secured, and the specific information that their commander was in the council chamber under a formal accounting proceeding, which meant the legal structure they had been operating under had been officially contested, and any further military action would be conducted without legal cover. Professional armies, even ones with ideological alignment to a particular cause, made calculations. When the calculations changed, the behavior changed. The Western divisions did not breach the walls. They held position. They waited. Varos Valor was brought to the council chamber in the 3rd hour, flanked by 2 of Wraith's soldiers, wearing the specific expression of a man who had run the scenarios and arrived at conclusions he did not like. He looked at Seraphine. Seraphine looked at him with the expression of a woman who had already made her calculations and was not revisiting them for his benefit. She said, "Tell them what they want to know." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "All of it." "All of it," she said. He looked at Draven. He told them all of it. The specific chain of authorization for the assassination attempts on Naira during her first weeks in the north. The dates, the names of the men hired. The courier routes used to pay them. The council members approached, and the specific inducements offered and accepted. The timeline of the intelligence manipulation, when it started, which analysts were compromised, which reports were altered, and in what specific ways. Nira sat at the edge of the table and listened to the architecture of what had been done to her and to Lucien, and she listened to it the way she had learned to listen to difficult information, completely, without filtering. Because filtering was how you missed the details that mattered, and the details always mattered. She had known most of it. The gaps were small. The overall picture was what she had built it to be. What she had not fully understood, until she heard Varos say it in the council chamber in the flat voice of a man who had stopped protecting anything, was the timeline on the first assassination attempt. She had crossed the eastern ridge in the dark with a sprained ankle and 4 months of pregnancy and 3 Valor operatives behind her. She had been closer to not surviving that night than she had allowed herself to understand at the time. She held this information and breathed through it and set it in the specific place where she kept the things that needed to be carried but not examined in real time. Draven looked at her across the table. She met his eyes. She did not give him the version that made it easier. She held his gaze with the full weight of what she had just heard and let him carry his portion of it without reducing it. He held it. He did not look away. None. By the time the accounting was complete and the formal record sealed with the council's witnesses, the city outside had gone quiet in the particular way of exhaustion rather than peace. The two states felt different from inside a building. Peace had a quality of release to it, a slight opening in the air. Exhaustion just sat there, heavy and present, asking nothing and giving nothing back. Draven stood from the table. He looked at Seraphine. She was still seated. Her posture had not broken over 4 hours. She held herself with the same architectural precision she had worn since the moment they walked through the door, because some people did not have a version of themselves that stopped performing competence even at the end. It was not dishonesty. It was just the only way they knew how to be present inside catastrophe. He said, "You will stand trial before a full council. New members, convened within 30 days, drawn from territories with no Valor financial connection." She said, "And the charges? Conspiracy, fraud, attempted assassination." He paused. "The council will determine what the charges warrant." She looked at him. She said, "You could have used the blade." "I know. 5 years ago you would have." He looked at her for a long moment. 5 years ago I made a lot of decisions I wouldn't make now." Something moved across her face. Not softness. Seraphine did not have softness. Or if she did, it lived behind architecture Naira had never seen her lower. It was something more complicated, the expression of a person recognizing a change in someone they had operated against for years and calibrating against it. She said, "She did that to you." He said, "I did it to myself. She just gave me 5 years to understand what it cost." Seraphine looked at Naira. Nira looked back. There was no version of this exchange that required anything from her. She had spent 5 years building the case that had just been laid out in this room. The case had done what it was built to do. What Seraphine felt about that was Seraphine's to carry. She said, "Take her to the northern hold, full guard, comfortable conditions." She said it to Wraith soldiers without looking away from Seraphine. She's not a prisoner to be degraded. She's a prisoner to be tried. Seraphine stood. She straightened her already straight gown. She walked to the door with the soldiers at her sides, and she did not look back, which was the only genuine thing Naira had ever seen her do. The refusal to perform a final moment for an audience. She left the room the way she had always entered rooms, as though she had decided the room and not the other way around. The door closed. The council chamber was empty except for Naira and Draven and the 4 hours of documentation spread across the table and the specific quality of silence that follows the conclusion of something that has been building for a very long time. Draven looked at the table. He said, "It's done." Nira said, "This part is done." He looked at her. She said, "The trial is in 30 days. The Western divisions need to be formally stood down, and their commanders need to be assessed individually for culpability versus compliance. The council needs to be reconstituted, the armory needs to be inventoried, and the compromised garrison officers need to be identified." She paused. "The 3 outer districts that burned Need immediate relief resources. Another pause. And Lucien needs to come home. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where's home?" She looked at him. It was a real question. She could see that it was a real question, not a political question about jurisdiction or a strategic question about the boy's placement in the succession picture. It was the question of a man who had spent the last 4 days understanding that he did not know the answer and that not knowing it was the most significant failure of his adult life. She said, "We'll figure that out." He said, "Naira." She said, "Not today. Today we get him, and we get everyone somewhere safe, and we let people eat and sleep." She picked up a section of the documentation and began organizing it for transport. "Everything else can wait one day." He watched her work for a moment. He said, "Can I help?" She paused. She looked at him with the specific expression of a person recalibrating the parameters of a question they had already answered once and were being asked to revisit. She said, "Yes?" She handed him a section of the ledgers. "Organize these by date. Earliest first." He took the ledgers. He began organizing them by date. They worked in silence for 40 minutes in the council chamber of a palace that still smelled faintly of smoke. And it was not comfortable, and it was not restored, and it was not anything that looked like what had existed before. It was 2 people doing the immediate work. It was enough for now. Kale brought Lucien to the palace in the early evening. The city was quieter than it had been. Not quiet, not safe yet in the sense that allowed the specific relaxation of vigilance that safety permitted, but quieter. The fires in the outer districts had been contained. Wraith's forces held the perimeter. The Western divisions had sent a formal request for terms, which meant they had finished calculating and had arrived at the conclusion that Naira had predicted. The legal structure had shifted, and professional survival required acknowledging the shift. Lucien came through the eastern gate with Kael beside him and Oren behind, and he walked through the palace's outer corridors with the particular quality of attention he brought to new environments, absorbing information without performing reaction, taking it in as data rather than spectacle. He found his mother in the antechamber off the main hall. She looked at him for 3 seconds before she said anything because she needed 3 seconds, and she was past the point of pretending she did not need things. He looked at her face. He said, "You came back." She said, "I said I would." He walked to her and she held him, and he allowed this for approximately 4 seconds before pulling back with the dignity of a child who was almost 6 and had opinions about the appropriate duration of embraces in public spaces. He looked at the room. He looked at the man standing at the far wall, who had been there when Lucien came in and had not moved and was not performing the specific neutrality of someone who was trying not to make a situation worse by existing in it. Lucien looked at Draven. He said, "You came back too." Draven said, "Yes." "From the council chamber?" "Yes." Lucien looked at him with those gray eyes that were doing the thing they always did. The full, uncalibrated assessment of a person who had not yet learned that assessment was supposed to be disguised. He said, "Malric told me who you are." The room held. Nira looked at Malric, who was in the doorway and had the expression of a man who had made a judgment call and was prepared to stand behind it. Draven looked at the boy. He said, "What did he tell you?" Lucien said, "That you're my father, that you didn't know about me until now, and that what happened wasn't simple." He paused. "He said I should decide what I think about it myself and not let anyone else decide for me." Draven looked at Malric. Malric held his gaze with the evenness that characterized everything he did. Not cold, not warm, just present and clear, and completely without apology. Draven looked back at his son. He said, "That's good advice." Lucien said, "I know. Malric gives good advice." He considered for a moment. "Do you?" Something moved in Draven's chest that Nira could see from across the room. Not the specific controlled shift of a man managing emotion, but the thing underneath that, the version of him that existed before the management and that she had not seen in 5 years and had wondered in the years since whether it still existed. He said, "I'm working on it." Lucien looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, Okay. He turned to Naira. Is there food? We didn't stop for food, and Oren kept saying we would, but we didn't. Naira said, There's food. He said, Good. And he walked past Draven toward the inner corridor with the direction of a child who had received the information he needed and was now attending to the next immediate priority. Draven watched him go. Naira watched Draven watch him go. She had thought across 5 years about what this moment would look like if it ever happened. She had imagined versions of it, some where it was more resolved, some where it was more broken, some where the years between the throne chamber and the council chamber had made it either easier or harder in ways she couldn't fully predict from inside the experience of living them. She had not imagined this. This specific quality of a man understanding, through a single exchange about food, what he had missed and what it had been and what it could not be returned to him. The particular devastation of loving something you have not earned and cannot claim and can only, if you are willing to do the work, begin to deserve. She said, He's going to ask you questions. Draven said, I know. Difficult ones. He doesn't soften them. I know. He looked at the corridor where Lucy Yen had gone. He's yours. He's his own. Yes. He paused. But the way he's his own, that's yours. She held that. She held it the way she had learned to hold the things that were true and complicated and did not resolve into simple responses. She said, Come eat. She walked to the corridor. He followed. The meal happened in the palace's secondary kitchen because the primary kitchen had been commandeered by Wraith's supply officers, and the secondary kitchen was smaller and had a fire and a table that fit 7 people without requiring ceremony. Malric sat at one end, Kael at the other. Wraith's second-in-command, a woman named Davan, who had the manner of someone who had been running on 2 hours of sleep for 3 days and had developed a philosophical relationship with that condition, sat beside Kael. Oren sat beside Lucien. Naira sat across from Draven, which was where she was going to sit rather than beside him, because across from was the configuration that allowed her to see his face, and seeing his face was still information she needed to be gathering. Lucien ate with the focused application of a child making up for missed meals. He ate, and he listened to the adult conversation around him with the specific quality of a child who understood that listening was a form of participation even when you were not speaking, and that the listening was more important right now than anything he could say. Wraith's second, Daven, laid out the current military position in the flat, unornamented way of someone too tired to dress information in anything but its facts. The Western divisions had sent formal terms. The Valor-aligned garrison officers had been identified and relieved. The outer district fires were contained and relief was being organized. The armory inventory would be complete by morning. Draven listened and asked specific questions, and the specific questions were the right questions, the ones that addressed the gaps in the information rather than the parts that were already clear. And Naira watched this and calibrated against it in the way she had always calibrated against his performance in rooms like this. He was the same in the ways that were professional. The same quality of attention, the same capacity to hold multiple complex information streams simultaneously and pull the relevant thread. The same voice in the room, the one that organized other voices around it without requiring volume. Different in the ways that weren't. Less weight in the chair, not less authority. Different authority, the kind that did not require the room to feel smaller in order to function. At some point, Lucien said, not loudly, the kind of observation children made when they had been quiet long enough that they had something to add. If the Western Division commanders were following orders they thought were legal, you can't treat them the same as the ones who knew the orders weren't. The table paused. Devon looked at the child. Lucien looked back at her without flinching. He said, It matters why someone did something, not just what they did. Kael looked at Malric. Malric looked at Lucien with an expression that was not quite pride and not quite amusement, and was some combination of both that did not have a clean name. Draven looked at his son. He said, You're right. Lucien accepted this with the equanimity of someone who had known he was right and was glad the information had been received. He went back to eating. The conversation resumed. Later, after the meal, and after the immediate operational matters had been addressed for the night, and after Lucien had been settled in a room that Naira had personally checked, and that had Oren on the other side of the door, Malric found her in the corridor outside. He leaned against the wall beside her, and they stood together in the way they had stood together through 5 years of difficult evenings, not requiring anything from the proximity, just sharing the specific weight of a day that had been too large for individual carrying. She said, "Thank you for telling him." Malric was quiet for a moment. "It was time. You could have waited for me. He deserved to hear it before he saw you carry it." He looked at the ceiling. "You would have managed it. You manage everything. But he needed to receive the information without watching you decide how to give it." She looked at the wall. She said, "You knew today was the day. I knew the day was going to come, and I knew we were in it." He paused. "I knew you weren't going to let yourself have the conversation from behind a wall." She breathed. She said, "What do you need? From what comes next?" He looked at her. It was the question she had been building toward for the last hour, and they both knew it, and he had been waiting for her to be ready to ask it directly rather than around the edges. He said, "The border agreement, the one we drafted before the summit." He paused. "It holds." "It holds," she said. "You have my word, and you'll have Draven's in writing within the week. I don't need it in writing. I know, but it should be in writing anyway because I'm not always going to be the person in the room when those agreements matter." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Lucien." She said, "Yes. He'll be here?" "He'll be everywhere he chooses to be." She looked at Malric directly. "Which will include Ravarin. That's not a negotiation. That's what he needs, and I'm not trading it for any political architecture, regardless of what the succession picture requires." Malric said, "I know." She said, "He loves you." Malric said nothing. She said, "That doesn't go away because the geography changes. He's not a child who forgets what he was given." Malric looked at the wall. She could see the thing that moved through him, and she let it move, and she did not help him with it, because some things needed to be felt in their full dimension, and helping was just another word for reducing. He said finally, "He needs to know both sides of what he is." "Yes." "And that requires—" He stopped. "It requires you to let him go enough to come back on his own terms." She paused. "Which you already know." He said, "Knowing it and doing it are different." "I know," she said. "I've been doing it since the day he was born." They stood in the corridor for another minute, side by side, in the specific companionship of people who had been in the same difficult rooms for a long time and who did not need to name what that meant to understand its weight. Then Malric said, "Get some sleep." She said, "You too." He pushed off the wall and walked down the corridor, and she watched him go with the specific feeling of a person who had been given something irreplaceable and who knew, with a clarity that did not require examination, that the debt was real and permanent, and that the only way to honor it was to live at the level it deserved. She did not sleep immediately. She sat in the room she had been given, small, functional, with a window that looked out over the inner courtyard where the palace's night torches were burning and the guards moved in their patterns. And she sat with the day and let herself feel its full weight now that she was alone and did not need to manage anything. The weight was considerable, not in the dramatic sense of devastation. She had carried devastation and she knew what it felt like, and this was not that. This was the weight of resolution, which was different. Heavier in some ways, because devastation had an energy to it, a forward momentum that kept you moving. Resolution asked you to stop moving and stand inside what had been built and understand it fully. She had built something. 5 years in hostile territory, with a newborn and a sprained ankle and the specific disadvantage of being a person who no longer had any institutional backing, she had built something that had just stood up under the weight of a direct assault by the most well-resourced political conspiracy she had ever encountered. She held that. She let it be real without diminishing it, and without letting it become the story she told herself about who she was, because she had watched too many people let their best moments become the architecture of their ego, and she had no interest in that particular trap. What she had done was not proof that she was extraordinary. It was proof that she had done what the situation required, one decision at a time, for 5 years, without the luxury of certainty about whether any of it was working. What survived was not a monument. It was a child who thought carefully about why people did things. It was a border agreement that might hold long enough to let two kingdoms breathe. It was a formal record in a council chamber that would make the next conspiracy harder to run in the dark. Small, specific things, built out of very ordinary materials. Attention, stubbornness, the willingness to stay at a problem after the initial energy of crisis had burned off, and what was left was the long, flat work. She sat with this until the torches in the courtyard had burned a third of the way down. Then she heard the knock. She already knew it was him. She said, "Come in." Draven opened the door and stood in it without entering. He had the specific posture of a man observing a boundary he had decided to respect in advance of being told to. He said, "I'm not going to stay." She said, "Okay." He said, "I needed to say something before the morning, before it becomes official and everything is in the context of what comes next." He held the door frame. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I understand that's not... I know what I did and I know what it cost, and I know that cost doesn't have a payment plan." He paused. "But I needed you to know that I understand it, not as a political calculation, not as a factor in the succession picture, as the actual thing it was." He looked at her. "You built something in 5 years that I couldn't have built in 15, with nothing, with a sprained ankle and a border you had never crossed, and people who had no particular reason to help you." She said, "They had reasons. You gave them reasons." He looked at her steadily. "You gave my son reasons to grow up into what he is." He stopped. "I just needed to say I know that, and that I'm going to spend whatever time I have left being someone who deserves to be in the room with both of you. Not because it benefits the Empire, because it's right." He paused once more. "That's all." He let go of the door frame. She said, "Draven." He stopped. She said, "He asked me once if you were going to fix what you did. I told him you were going to try. That's the only version of this I have room for right now." She held his eyes. "Don't make me wrong about that." He said, "I won't." She said, "Good night." He said, "Good night." He closed the door. She sat with what remained in the room after he left. The specific quality of a conversation that had not resolved anything and had said exactly what needed to be said, which was not the same as resolution, but was the prerequisite for it. She had not forgiven him. She was not going to perform forgiveness on a timeline that served anyone else's need for the story to be complete. Forgiveness was a private process that happened in its own time at its own pace, and it did not require an audience, and it did not require a ceremony, and it certainly did not require it to be done before morning, because morning brought the next set of things that needed doing. What she had was something more durable than premature forgiveness. She had the truth on paper in a council record. She had her son safe in a room down the hall. She had Malric's word and the border agreement and the beginning of something that might, with enough careful work, become the kind of peace that did not require constant maintenance. She had the specific knowledge, worn into her by 5 years of evidence, that she was capable of building something real out of nothing, which was the one piece of information about herself that nothing could take back. She lay down. She looked at the ceiling. She slept. The months that followed moved at the pace of reconstruction, which was slower than crisis and more demanding in ways that crisis never prepared you for. Crisis had a clarity to it. The threat was visible. The response was urgent. The measure of success was survival. Reconstruction had none of that. It was murky and contentious and full of people who had survived the crisis with different ideas about what the survival was supposed to have been for. Nira worked. She worked the way she had always worked, from the material available, without waiting for ideal conditions that were not coming, with the specific patience of someone who had learned that the most durable things were built slowly, and that the urgency that felt like productivity was often just the performance of it. The council was reconstituted with 31 members drawn from 12 territories, with a formal charter that distributed the financial oversight in a way that made the Valor model of corruption structurally harder to replicate. Not impossible. Nothing was impossible to a sufficiently motivated conspiracy with sufficient time, but harder. Harder was what you could build. Perfect was what people proposed instead of building anything. The border agreement between the Dominion and Rav-Aren was formalized in a document that was deliberately unglamorous. No ceremonial hall, no river of golden fire, No assembled court. Draven and Malric signed it in the secondary command room at Duskavar, with Naira as the primary witness and Kyle as the secondary, and Lucian sitting at the end of the table with his charcoal and his smaller map, marking the new border positions as the terms were read aloud. Draven looked at the boy while Malric was reading. Malric noticed. Neither man said anything about it. What existed between them was not friendship. They were too honest with each other and had too much history on the wrong side of it for friendship to be the accurate word. What existed was something more functional and, in its way, more durable. The specific relationship between two people who had each chosen the same child and who understood that the choice committed them to a form of civility that was not performed but was built out of the actual material of their mutual investment. They disagreed on almost everything. They were both good at what they did. Lucian learned from both of them and synthesized what he learned into something that belonged to neither, which was exactly what it was supposed to do. Seraphine's trial convened 43 days after the council chamber accounting. Nira attended as a witness. She gave her testimony with the same precision she brought to intelligence briefings, specific, documented, organized by date and chain of evidence rather than by emotional impact. The council listened. The formal record expanded. The legal architecture that would govern the outcome became, across 3 days of proceedings, something that would not be easily undone by the next person who decided that the gap between power and accountability was an opportunity. Seraphine conducted herself at trial with the same composure she had conducted herself with in the council chamber. She did not deny what the evidence established. She contextualized it, argued its necessity, made the case that the Dominion's stability had required someone to do the things she had done and that the Empire would have preferred not to examine. There was some truth in that. Nira sat in the witness position and listened to the truth in it and did not let it do anything to the other truth, which was that the things done had been done to her and to her child, and that the architecture of necessity had been built on decisions that other people had not consented to be the material of. Both things were true. That was what made the reckoning real rather than simple. The council's judgment was proportionate in the way that proportionate judgments always felt insufficient to the people who had been most directly harmed, and excessive to the people who believed the power that had been wielded was justified by the outcomes it produced. Seraphine was stripped of the Valor seat on the council and of the family's eastern trade route privileges and was remanded to house containment in the borderland estate that represented the Valor family's oldest and least strategically significant holding. Not execution, not exile. A reduction. A specific, calibrated reduction that left her alive and present and permanently unable to reconstitute the network from a position of institutional access. It was the right outcome. Naira knew it was the right outcome because the right outcome was the one that addressed the actual problem, which was the network and the access, rather than the person, who was a symptom of a structural vulnerability that the network had been designed to exploit. She left the trial and walked to the outer courtyard and stood in the cold air that smelled like autumn and stone and felt the specific quality of something finished, not complete. Finished. There was a difference. Complete would have required the thing to be whole, to be returned to what it had been before. Finished just meant the active part was over, and what remained was the long, ordinary work of living inside what had been built. She could do that. She had been doing it in various forms for 6 years. The first time Draven and Lucienne spent time alone was not arranged. It happened because Naira was in a council logistics meeting that ran long, and because Oren had gone to handle a supply matter, and because Lucian, who did not experience unscheduled time as a problem to be solved, but as an opportunity to investigate something, had found his way to the palace's training yard. Draven was there. He was not there because he had arranged to be there. He was there because the training yard was where he went when he needed to think, and did not want to think, with his voice, which was a habit Lucien would later observe was one of the few things about his father that he understood without being told. He found the king working through a sword form alone, and he sat on the yard's low wall and watched. He did not announce himself. He just sat there with the attention of someone who found the thing in front of them genuinely interesting and did not feel the need to perform that interest out loud. At some point, Draven became aware of him. He completed the form. He lowered the sword. He said, "How long have you been there?" Lucien said, "Long enough to see you do the sequence wrong." A pause. Draven said, "Which part?" Lucian said, "The third transition. You're dropping your shoulder. Malric does the same thing, and Kael told him about it, and Malric said it was a habit from his left-handed compensation, and then Kael showed him the correction, but Malric still does it sometimes when he's thinking about something else." Draven looked at the boy. He said, "Do you want to show me the correction?" Lucian slid off the wall. He was almost 6, and he was not large, and the training sword he picked up from the rack was the smallest available, and still slightly too heavy for his proportions, but he held it with the ease of someone who had been working with it long enough to have made peace with the weight. He showed Draven the correction. He showed it with the specific economy of a child who had learned from adults who did not explain more than was necessary. The movement itself, demonstrated twice, without verbal accompaniment except a brief, "There." Draven looked at his son demonstrating a sword correction in the training yard of his own palace. He did the sequence again. He did it correctly. Lucien said, "Better." He put the training sword back on the rack and climbed back onto the wall and went back to watching with the equanimity of someone who had done what was needed and had no particular need for acknowledgement beyond the correction being received. They stayed in the yard for another hour. They did not talk much. What they did was be in the same space without requiring the space to mean more than it meant, which was itself a thing, a first thing, a small thing, the kind of thing that only mattered because it had to come before everything else. Nira heard about it from Oren, who had heard about it from the garrison soldier whose duty station overlooked the training yard. She did not seek Draven out to discuss it. She sat with it in the way she had learned to sit with things that were moving in the right direction, without pulling at them, without trying to accelerate them past the pace they were moving at, because the pace they were moving at was the pace they could sustain, and sustainable was the only thing she had ever been able to build that actually held. What she felt was not happiness in the simple sense. It was something more textured and more earned. The specific feeling of a person who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has felt the weight shift fractionally, not removed, not resolved, just redistributed in a way that acknowledged that the weight had always been meant for more than one person. She sat with it. She let it be true. On the last day of autumn, when the capital was in the specific transitional state between the harvest season and the preparation for winter, Naira walked to the outer wall of the palace alone in the early morning. She walked there because the outer wall had a view she had found in her second week back in the capital and had returned to several times since, a section of the eastern parapet where you could see, if the weather was clear, the distant suggestion of the northern territories on the horizon. The ridge she had crossed in the dark with a sprained ankle and 4 months of pregnancy, and the specific determination of a person who had decided that not surviving was not an option. She looked at it. She thought about the person who had crossed that ridge, about what that person had known at the time and what she had not known, about the things she had been afraid of and the specific way she had moved through the fear, not past it, not despite it, but through it, carrying it as information rather than treating it as obstruction. She had built something that held. She had raised someone who understood the difference between why and what. She had watched an empire's worst impulses get named in a council record. She had walked through a door she had been thrown out of and stood inside it until it was done. None of it had made her invulnerable. None of it had made the things that had been broken whole. None of it had given her back the years in the northern wilderness or the specific quality of the life she had believed was ahead of her before the throne chamber door closed. What it had given her was something she had built herself, out of her own choices and her own stubbornness, and the specific help of people who had decided she was worth helping when the empire she had served for 4 years had decided she was disposable. She held that. She let it be what it was. Not triumph, not the conclusion of a journey, just the specific mourning of a person who had survived what she had survived and who was still standing with something real underneath her feet, looking north at the ridge that had been the first day of a different life, understanding that both lives were hers, the one before and the one she had built, and that neither one was required to erase the other for the current one to have value. The sun came over the eastern wall of the capital. It was cold, clear, the kind of morning that had no interest in being symbolic. She breathed it in. She went back inside to work. Months later, In the historical record that future councils would compile about the period they came to call the Consolidation, there would be a paragraph devoted to what had been accomplished in the aftermath of the Seraphine-Valor conspiracy. The paragraph would note the border agreement, the council reconstitution, the Western Division's reintegration under new command structure, the 3 outer districts rebuilt, the armory restored. It would note, in the specific dry language that historical records used when they did not have adequate vocabulary for what they were actually describing, that the Iron Dominion's transition from its first era to its second was facilitated by the work of an advisor of significant intelligence capacity, whose contributions to the Reconstruction period were foundational. The paragraph would not be adequate. Adequate paragraphs did not exist for what it looked like from the inside. For the 4-hour accounting in the council chamber, for the 18-hour pass in the dark, for the specific quality of the training yard morning when a king learned a sword correction from his son and did not look away from what that meant. For the years before all of it, in Raverin, when none of the outcome was certain and the work had to be done anyway. For the specific, irreducible fact that the most dangerous thing in the empire had not been the armies or the conspiracies or the legal architecture of succession. It had been a woman who crossed a collapsed ridge in the dark and kept going. The empire that emerged on the other side of everything she built was not the same empire. It was better in ways that were hard to articulate and easy to see in practice, in the council charter, in the border agreement, in the face of a child who grew up understanding that power was a thing you earned by doing what it required rather than a thing you accumulated by doing what you could get away with. The record would not capture any of this. It did not need to. The people who had lived inside it knew what it was. That was enough. That had always been enough.